UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, good morning. It's just gone 10 o'clock. I'm Russell Quirk, not Alex Phillips, unfortunately. She is poorly, so I will be in the hot seat until 1 o'clock. Then, of course, Ian Collins thereafter. OK, so a hot act to follow in Mike Graham. Sounds like he had an informative and fun show, so we'll try and follow that in good order. We're going to be talking about this economy thing, as Mike was in his show. It's the economy stupid. Do you remember that saying? Well, I think the only stupid person in the room when it comes to our economy is clearly our Chancellor. I don't think she understands economics at all, despite the fact that she's apparently an economist. I know there's a big question mark over that insofar as her CV, her credentials, and who knew when you fib about your CV and your credentials and your ability, it comes back to bite you. And it seems to be because Rachel Reeves' ex-employer, the Bank of England, have effectively chastised her over the last 24 hours or so. They've cut back our forecast as a country for growth in GDP terms. They said that inflation is going to rise and that our public sector is bloated. Doesn't sound very good, does it? We did, as I was just saying to Mike in the handover, we did rather warn everybody that if you vote for a Labour government, it will potentially be a return to the 70s and the economy will not be very nice. 7 months in, here we are. So obviously we're going to be talking about that during the show. You might have heard in the news just now this utterly ridiculous story from the Science Museum where they have put in place, presumably at great cost, a guide, and that guide seemingly says that Lego bricks are potentially anti-LGBT. I'll explain their rationale, certainly not my rationale, because it's nonsense, it's nuts, it's bonkers. A bit later on with Kate Barker, who's the CEO of the LGB Alliance. So yes, in addition to museums being racist and statues being racist, Lego is anti-LGBT, I'll have you know. So yes, that's coming up. Also going to be talking a little bit about the US, this US aid thing, whereby it seems that $55 billion, not a small amount of money, has been funneled to some rather unworthy and unjustifiable causes. We're going to be talking about that as Donald Trump squeezes that particular organisation and exposes it really for some of the money, the taxpayers' money that is being wasted over there, and also the fact that Donald Trump has just sanctioned, it seems, the International Criminal Court for their illegitimate and baseless charges against Benjamin Netanyahu. So yes, hopefully an interesting, informative and entertaining show coming up. But look, let's kick off first off with James Price, who is former Conservative government advisor. I think he was in the Treasury. James, good morning.
Good morning, sir. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Good to see you. Good to hear you. So you're rather well qualified, aren't you? Which I guess is why the producers have got you on the show to talk about the devastation, the travesty that is, and let's call it what it is, Rachel Reeves' hapless economy. Just talk us through exactly what her ex-employer has said over the last 24 hours. And I am laughing because the irony should not be lost on us. It's not good news, is it, for Rachel Reeves? It's rather embarrassing, I would say, in fact.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Rachel has had much good news ever since that Labour won the election by default, and she was finding herself in that dream job that she'd so massaged perhaps her CV for. I should say, by the way, that being underqualified has never stopped me from weighing in on any other topic. But let's try and disimpact.
Well, being underqualified, I mean, you're in good company where Rachel Reeves is concerned, because she's clearly underqualified, isn't she?
Look, it's a really tough job. Let's start with a bit of couching in her favour there. But look, I think that's right. I think the big problem you've got is that the Labour Party of today is a lot more statist, a lot more left-wing, a lot more radical than any Labour Party we've ever really probably seen in government, maybe with the exception of Clement Attlee's just after the war. Tony Blair, and who was it in his team who said we're very relaxed about people getting filthy rich? And, they basically kept all the kind of agreed policies of the Thatcher governments and then John Major as well, and the economy kept doing well, and they didn't meddle with it nearly as much as they might have done. Unfortunately, some Tory meddling, but mostly now in these last 6 months, Labour's radical lack of wanting to even understand how the private sector really operates is coming back to bite them very, very quickly. With the exception of Rachel Reeves, who did do a few years working in the private sector. She said she was an economist for these banks. Actually, it turns out she might have been in the accountancy team or the complaints department or something like that.
James, I mean, the question mark on her CV was with regard to HBOS, I think, wasn't it? A bank that she previously worked for, where she herself changed her CV and admitted that she changed it and then changed it back. I think there's still a big question mark, a grey area with regard to what she actually did at the Bank of England. I mean, I would suggest, tongue-in-cheek, that maybe her job at the Bank of England was she was in the canteen or emptying the bins, because, you know, her presiding over the economy over the last 7 months, bearing in mind, and here are the facts, right? We should recap. The economy, of course, was not in a particularly good place, James, was it? We know, under the previous government, and for a whole bunch of reasons, whether it was energy prices caused by the Ukraine war or the recovery from COVID. We know that the economy suffered, particularly because of inflation and the resulting interest rate increases as a consequence of that. But it's fair to say, in the last 6 months of Rishi Sunak's government, despite the fact him going to the country arguably far too early as a consequence of this, the economy was recovering. Inflation dropped below 2%, which is the bank's target. Interest rates started to drop. Unemployment was very, very minimal, not increasing. And no matter what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer might now say about the economy and what they inherited in this fictitious £22 billion black hole, which seems to be ever more unlikely, frankly, in terms of its very existence, they have, in 7 months, destroyed the economy. I mean, in 7 months, we now are in GDP negative growth. In other words, our economy is shrinking. Yes, interest rates have dropped. Of course, interest rates dropped yesterday to 4.5%, but that really was as a consequence of the Bank of England saying the economy's in trouble, so we've got to drop borrowing rates in order to help it out, so to speak. So, I mean, Rachel Reeves, in terms of her budget on October the 30th, has to take full responsibility for this, doesn't she? I don't think there's any defending where we are now in terms of the size of our economy, unemployment starting to increase, inflation now starting to increase. And this thing yesterday, which is why we're talking as we are, James, the fact that her old employer, the Bank of England, now says that our growth over the next 12 months won't be 1.5%, it won't be 1% even, it's going to be, this is their forecast, only 0.75%. And inflation, scarily, is going to increase to 3.7%, which basically means, in layman's terms, not only will the cost of things get more expensive, but it means that the threat of higher interest rates and higher mortgages is upon us. Once again, there's no defending it, James.
No, you're absolutely right. And the scary thing about this is, as I was saying, that Rachel Reeves is the one person around the Labour cabinet table who has any experience of the real economy at all. And she's the one doing this. So goodness knows the kind of negative effects that are going to be caused by the complete loons in the form of Ed Miliband and Bridget Phillipson at education and some of these people, and the kind of damage and danger that they're wreaking right across other sectors of the British state. Reeves is the sensible one, right? And that you've laid very well how badly she has affected with her budget the economy. She's the sensible one. That should strike terror into the hearts of everybody. But yeah, let's talk about what the fundamental bits are here. I think it is just the fact that the Labour Party doesn't have any understanding about how the economy works or how incentives work. They think, right, well, we'll put tax up because there are rich people out there, and the rich people have taken that money from the poor people, and that's bad, so let's take it off them and everything will be good. It's literally as reductive and simple as that in the kind of socialist mindset. There's no idea that incentives might work, that people might work hard so they can keep more of their earnings, that they might therefore, if they've got a few bob, that they will then invest that money and help create more businesses that make more growth, more jobs for people. And of course, more growth means more taxes for you to be able to spend on things like hospitals and schools if you want to. Or you can, of course, cut taxes and let people, families, individuals, businesses keep more of their own money because they know how to spend that money better than any government ever could, and certainly more than this Labour government knows how.
Well, I think that's a great pitch, James, for you to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. But I would also argue, my daughter's doing A-level economics. I think she would be better qualified. She would understand, as most people listening to this and watching this understand, that you cannot, and I know this is a well-worn phrase now, you cannot tax your way to growth. That was tried in the 70s. and in many other Marxist and left-wing countries across the world, communism, for instance. And it simply hasn't worked. It's never going to work. Because, of course, then people leave, but it's a disincentive. And the sentiment signal that it sends to everybody is that basically Britain is not open for business. And the issue here, I think, we get back to this question of ideology and the fact that Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer and the front bench have sat in the wings for a long, long time, salivating about the prospect of taking power, only so that they can enact their Marxist ideology on the country, as if it was some kind of real-life sixth form politics experiment. And what we're seeing 7 months in already, I mean, we've got another 4 years to go of this, already is the fact that millionaires are leaving Britain at a significantly fast rate now, one every 45 minutes apparently. We're going to end up with the equivalent of a brain drain, therefore. So all of the wealth creators, the business owners, the entrepreneurs going. And at the same time, the other part of this story, James, of course, is the Bank of England have also said that one of the problems with Britain's economy now is our bloated public sector. Now, of course, what do Labour ideologues love? Well, that is a bloated public sector, and we know that, A, because there's now more and more of them, even since the last election in July, but also, of course, they've all been given stonking great pay rises. So this kind of double whammy of taxing wealth creators and shoring up and bloating the public sector. I mean, no wonder some pundits, some economists are saying that Britain potentially, I'm choosing my words carefully here, but potentially could go bankrupt. We end up going cap in hand to the IMF. I mean, do you think that's a real prospect?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I agree with an awful lot of it. Let's not forget that Britain did go to the IMF cap in hand in the 1970s, and we tried again. High taxes, lots of inflation, lots of state control, a big bloated public sector, thinking of the wealth creators as evil rather than as being the kind of geniuses who work very hard that they are, and all the people working in the private sector just to try and put food on the table. Winston Churchill was the man who said that trying to tax your way to prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket and then trying to lift himself up by the handle, right?
Such a great quote, and so apt.
And it's so true. And I think, again, it goes to the Labour failed socialist mindset. They think not only, as we've said there, is private sector bad, not just the kind of big banker fat cats that they like to go on about, but even the bloke who's, owns a small plumbing business in Gloucester, where I'm from, or wherever it may be. Anyone who tries to do that, who tries to make something more for themselves and to rise above their station, is a kind of class traitor or greedy capitalist or something horrible like that. At the same time, they want the state to be as big as possible. They think the state knows best because they think they know best. Therefore, of course, they want the state to have lots of power, and they cannot see, because none of them have ever worked for the profit motive before. They've never tried to, have to earn something to keep the bottom line up because they can just go and sponge off the taxpayer. They don't see how inefficient and rubbish, frankly, so much of the public sector is, because it doesn't have those kinds of drivers. And look, I've worked in multiple different government departments. I'm critical of the civil service a lot. There are amazing civil servants, both in the central government and in local government. Brilliant people who do keep the lights on, who work very hard, especially in the kind of national security bits and in other areas. But they're also struggling under this terrible system. Much like the NHS is full of wonderful people, but the system is rubbish.
But James, sorry,
I can't fix any of that.
I would argue that one of the reasons that the civil service and the public sector aren't working is because of those civil servants. So it's not the politicians necessarily that are the ones that are responsible for, day-to-day inefficiencies, whether it be in the Home Office or the NHS. We talk about on this channel regularly, particularly when it comes to tragedies and travesties around kind of child deaths and people being stabbed and so on, that, there are people in the public sector, in public authority, that are simply not doing their jobs. They're letting things fall through the cracks, slip through their fingers. We have a real problem, I think, with our public sector. Not only is it bloated, not only is it very, very expensive. The cost of civil servants now, by the way, is about £16 billion per annum just in wages. But I think we have a distinct and utter lack of accountability and transparency, because if you're not accountable for something that happens, whether it be Axel Rudabikana and him slipping through the net several times, or whoever, if you're not accountable individually, personally, then you're not going to perhaps be particularly concerned about being as efficient as otherwise you might. It's a debate for another time, James, probably in terms of the civil service itself, but I'm just picking up on your point that it's kind of, I wouldn't lament the fact that civil servants are sitting there, exposed at the behest of others. I think civil servants are part of the problem. And now we've got more and more and more of them. We've got 500,000 more civil servants now than we had before the pandemic. How can that be justified when the Bank of England says they're about 8% less productive than they were before the pandemic? So to be clear, we have more civil servants earning more money, doing less.
Yeah, well, again, it's the perfect distillation of the socialist mindset. It's not working, so let's double down on the problem. That is the idea that they've got, and they cannot. It's the idea that you might want to have the private sector doing things. The way that Nigel Farage was tried to shout down at Prime Minister's questions this time over the idea that the NHS isn't as wonderfully as efficient as it might be, and having some kind of private provision, at least, of services might not be a terrible thing. This is the kind of problem that you've got. And I just want everybody at home to think, when the last time you interacted with the state was? Maybe it was you had your mobile phone nicked out of your hand by the police and they didn't do anything about it. Maybe it was a difficult time you had with school or with the NHS, or some infuriating bureaucrat, busybody, pencil pusher in some state bureaucracy. It was probably not a very nice experience. Nothing's going right. So when you can't get the basics right, potholes not being filled in, your parents' cancer's not being caught, your kids are being taught woke tosh in schools, you think you really want to give more power to the state to do more things?
Well,
no.
I suspect
James, doing more things well.
James, when you talk about doubling down, I suspect that what we will now will see, because of course there'll be presumably a spring statement by Rachel Reeves as Chancellor. Do you think that because the so-called black hole will be seen to be bigger, because the leeway that the Chancellor has in her budget is now curtailed because of her own budget, ironically enough, that she herself will double down and will end up with more tax rises in the next 3 or 4 months? Do you think that's likely?
I've got a hope for the future of this country, because I think you're right. There is a non-zero risk that we do enter a kind of economic doom loop here, a doom spiral, not just to the economics, frankly, but also, the numbers of mass migration we're having coming in, that the country could really be in a pickle. Rachel Reeves is, as I say, she's the sensible one. She does realise some of this, and she has tried to talk about growth. I think she's realised that her budget was pretty disastrous, even though she couldn't say it. So there is a small chance that she realises this, and she has to kind of go for broke to get growth going again. But when you've got mad Ed Miliband trying to bankrupt the country with high energy bills, and you've got Bridget Phillipson destroying the best thing about the country, which is how our educational system has improved recently, and when you've got Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, who, as Robert Jenrick described him as being Jeremy Corbyn in a barrister's wig, hell-bent on giving £18 billion to the country of Mauritius in order that they would take our sovereign territory with a military base in there, and saying we absolutely must do this because of a non-binding resolution from the International Court of Justice that we don't even recognise when it comes to countries like Mauritius, then we're completely doomed. And by the way, that 8 billion is more than the entire GDP of Mauritius. So we could just buy Mauritius for that matter.
Wow, I didn't know that. What an interesting fact. I was going to ask you, actually, that maybe the cabinet of this government, the front bench, might actually start seeing sense and try to point Rachel Reeves in the right direction on the economy. But as you've just summed up a large slice of them there in terms of their inabilities and their faux pas, I don't think we hold out much hope, I'm afraid, James, do we?
No, I think that's right. And look, Wes Streeting, the health secretary, give him some credit. He realises that the NHS, for example, is in a bit of a pickle, and I think he's probably willing to countenance some quite radical things. I think Liz Kendall has been quite quiet recently. She's the Work and Pension Secretary.
Well, she's said something quite interesting over the last 24 hours, hasn't she? That being anxious or being a bit sad is not a reason to be off work. I mean, a rare element of sense from a Labour frontbencher there.
Yeah, absolutely right. And look, even Yvette Cooper, who I'm not a huge fan of in lots of ways, has decided that she's going to be banning pointing kitchen knives rather than locking up the little rascals who can't help but grab those kitchen knives and go around stabbing and killing everybody. If they can get to grips on mass migration, if they can shut the borders and seal them up and deport every single illegal migrant who's here, because everybody who's entered this country who has entered illegally is a criminal and must be deported. Labour, of course, took away the provision that says if you enter this country illegally, you'll never be allowed to stay. But she talks tough on immigration, and because the Tories were so weak on it, they've got a chance to make some headway there. There are a couple of bits of hope that we have to hope, because, as you say, it's still 4 years of this ghastly government to go. Some hope that some of them will see sense. But when you've got Bridget Phillipson in education, Hermer, again, Corbyn in a barrister's wig, trying to give our money away to foreign countries, and Red Ed Miliband, I don't hold out a huge amount of hope for us.
Yes, OK, on that cheery note, James Price, we'll leave it there until next time. That's James Price, former Conservative Government Advisor, and as you can probably tell, to a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dean Zahawi. OK, look, we're going to come back after this, but I would welcome your calls, 0344 499 1000. Let us know what you think about this. Are you fine with the way that things are going economically? How do you feel, actually, about this extra money in your pocket that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves keep talking about? They seem to be obsessed with that phrase, and also the other one, of course, that they are peddling is growth, growth, growth. Do you feel like the growth, the economy is growing? Do you feel like you have more money in your pocket? Do you feel better off? Or are you as concerned as I am that effectively we've got a load of sixth form politics students in government and their ideology is going to drive the economy into the ground? We're going to end up potentially the equivalent economically of a third world country. Let me know what you think. 0344 499 1000. We'd love to hear your views, your opinions, whether you agree, whether you disagree. Obviously, you can text as ever 87222. Put the word talk before your message, or you can leave a voice note, as many people have already today, it seems, by dialing 0344 499 1000 via WhatsApp. I'm Russell Quirk. I'm in for Alex Phillips. I'll be back in a couple of minutes just after this.
So you have more of an international welfare state. And I think that the Conservatives have a great deal to answer for, especially in the last parliamentary term. Immigration skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. And Alex, all too often we were told that our immigration system attracts the brightest and the best. We have a rigorous, highly selective immigration system. And that is what people wanted, especially those who voted for Brexit back in June 2016. That was not the immigration system that was introduced.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. I'm Russell Quirk, and we are talking about the economy. We're also going to be talking about Lego. Now, this might be something that gets your heckles up. The fact that the Science Museum have funded a self-guided tour of their museum, and when you get to the Lego bit, they kind of apologise on the basis that Lego apparently might be anti-LGBT. What ever next. Do let me know what you think about that. But in particular, for the next couple of minutes, what you think about the economy. I mean, look, maybe it doesn't bother you. Maybe you feel that interest rates are dropping, which of course they did yesterday. The Bank of England reduced rates to 4.5%. Mortgage rates are pretty palatable. Maybe you think, no matter what's happening in the economy and all this talk about black holes and micro this and macro that, maybe you don't believe it affects you. Believe me, if Rachel Reeves carries on in the same direction, it really will, particularly if the Bank of England are right and inflation starts to increase to 3.5% to 4%, which is what they're forecasting. Interest rates start going up, and you're all going to feel rather worse off, particularly if we have to go to the International Monetary Fund and ask for a bailout, as if we were Uganda or Zimbabwe. Let's go to some of your messages. I've got a couple of calls to bring to you in a second as well. So Michael Wilkinson, Mike in Lincoln says, "Morning, Russell. I think both Labour and the Tories have failed to grasp the politics of Britain. They have changed. I truly believe we're living through the last gasp of the Labour Party and the amount of damage that they're going to do to Britain with Chagos, the economy and net zero, that we will never forgive them and they will never be elected to govern ever again. They'll join the Tories on the island of exile. Reform will be the next government and will spend their first term in office undoing decades of Labour and Tory incompetence." Do you agree with Mike? Do you agree that the Conservatives and Labour, they've had their day as having run multiple governments over the last few decades and not having done, particularly recently, a particularly wonderful job? Do you think reform can actually take government and actually end up with a majority in Parliament? Bearing in mind, let me remind you, they have 5 Reform MPs. You'd need something like 326, I think, MPs to form a government. Do you really think they can do that? I mean, they are flying high in the polls. In some polls, they are ahead of Labour. They are ahead of the Conservatives. But that's a bit of a tall order, don't you think? Do you think reform can do it? 0344 499 1000 or send me a text, 87222. Let me know what you think. And frankly, it's easy to say that reform are our saviour and that they are going to be the next government. I think that's very, very hard to imagine at the moment, frankly, when there's only 5 of them. I'm not saying that they are not a solution. They're certainly a good solution, I suspect, to the uni party, as many people call the Conservative and Labour lot, who have continually and monumentally failed us for a number of years. But let me know if you think it's practical for reform to go from 5 MPs to well over 300. Let's see. 4 years is a long time. Let's speak to Phil in Hertfordshire now. Phil, thanks for calling Talk. How are you this morning?
Good morning, Russell. Yeah, I'm really well. Yeah, how are you? Are you good?
I'm good. I'm just a bit worried about the economy, mate.
Well, yeah, I'm worried about the economy. I wasn't actually rigging up for that, but I can mention, I'm a small business owner, and obviously inflation with prices going up and up and up, but we can't, for the work that we do for our customers, I can't really pass that on to them because it's local authorities. So, of course, they're cutting back because they've got to pay all this national insurance. So, obviously, our profit margins are getting slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. So it's getting really, really tight for us. Really tight.
Well, look, tight for everybody. And I think what the government need to understand is it's people like you that actually drive growth. It's not civil servants in the public sector. It is not building 3rd runways in 25 years' time, frankly, although look, I'm not saying that doesn't help. The way to grow an economy is through consumers spending money and businesses like you investing, growing and employing more people. I don't think Rachel Reeves got the memo. You want to talk about Lego, Phil, don't you?
I know. Well, no, I was having a good day. I was having a good day until that was mentioned.
Has this wound you up?
It has wound me up. I can't... It's beyond comprehension, the idiocy of this. It's absolutely ridiculous. What on earth is going to be next? Putting a top on a pen and plugging a plug into a socket?
Well, we're going to do this properly later, Phil. But let me just for context, as you called about it, because I did mention it, obviously, in the at the beginning of the show. Let me just put this into context in terms of what this story is all about. This is in the Telegraph today, so I'll kind of read some of this verbatim just so that you get an idea of how ridiculous this is. But this is true. This is not April the 1st. This is a self-guided museum tour on stories of queer communities, experiences and identities. Includes a display of Lego bricks alongside a guide stating that the plastic blocks may reinforce the idea that heterosexuality is the norm. Wow. So they've made a link between Lego bricks and heterosexuality. And do you know why they've made the link? I don't know if you've read this story, Phil. Shall I just explain? It gets even more ridiculous. Basically, because Lego bricks have what you would call a male side and a female side, and when you put them together, it could, if you were really stretching your imagination and you were particularly woke, you could then see that as, inverted commas, mating, where the male side, Phil, of course, is in that respect dominant, which is why Lego is basically anti-LGBT. I rarely have seen, and I've seen some ridiculous stuff that I talked about on Talk over the last 3 or 4 years, I've rarely seen anything quite as ridiculous and nonsensical as this, mate.
Seriously, these people are literally off the planet. They need to get on Elon Musk's rocket to Mars. So what we're going to do, we're not going to put our foot in a sock and put a shoe on.
Yeah, exactly. But let me ask you this, Phil. These people, I mean, these people that have worked, I guess, look, maybe it's not the Science Museum, but people within the Science Museum that have seen fit to come out with this nonsense. And it actually might be a very, very clever piece of PR. Now, bearing in mind I run a PR agency, that's my proper job. This could actually be a genius bit of PR that's now getting us all talking about the Science Museum. You know, maybe over the next few days we'll see visits to the Science Museum increase significantly. But do you think these people are mentally ill, Phil?
They're not far off of it. Either that or they haven't got enough work to do, proper work. And they are so bored picking their fingers, flicking bits of paper around, bending paper clips.
I know.
They've just got to come up with something.
Let's see. Look, Phil, I've got to move on because we've got loads and loads of calls to get through, but I appreciate your call. Until next time, that's Paul in Newport. That's Phil in Hertfordshire. Now we're going to speak to Paul in Newport, who I think wants to make a comment on what I was talking about just now with regard to reform. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well. Look, I mean, I manage a small business here, okay, and it's tough. It is proper tough. And if I'm honest, over the last 20 years, 30 years, no government has ever helped small businesses. We try our best. We've got great teams around us, and we just mullered every time. With regards to reform, I think at the next election, reform will become the official opposition.
So you think they'll get over 320 MPs in 4 years' time?
I don't think they will in this one. I think the next election they will become the official opposition, and then if they do as we hope that they will do, and they stand there. Do you remember when Nigel was in the EU? Every time he stood up, he just used to say, "Okay, we've done." One of the ones I remember he said, "Okay, there was some project." It was in like 2018, 2019, and the project was given a 14 billion euro budget.
Yeah.
10 years before the project was due to start. The project was due to start in like 2027. They'd already handed out something like 900 million euros, okay? Mm-hmm. And Nigel was going, this project isn't going to start for like 10 years. And yet we've already handed out the thick end of £1 billion. How do you know, £1 billion euros? How do you even know that those companies that you've given the money to will still be around when the project starts? Mm. And he was in there like a ferret, wasn't he?
Do you think do you think Nigel Farage is our Trump?
I think he is, but I think, to be honest with you, he needs to get to the fore. When there was PMQs on Wednesday and they take the mickey out of him because they say, "Oh, you found Clacton," then he leaves himself open.
And when do we think the last time Keir Starmer went to his constituents in Islington was? I wonder.
Yeah, but he can always say, "Oh, yes, but I've got, I'm doing things on a national front. I'm doing things on a national scale. I need to be in Ukraine or wherever." Whereas Nigel is Clacton. And Nigel needs to stand on the platform of Clacton, but talk on a national scale and an international scale. Let's be honest, Nigel knows Trump better than Starmer, better than anyone else.
Well, Paul, let me tell you just an aside. I've been an elected representative, albeit on a council level. It is not really about knocking on doors every day and sitting there, listening to people whinging about the council. The job of politics is to make laws, make good laws, and make people's lives better, which I'm afraid, whether we like it or not, is generally done in Parliament. And I suspect Nigel Farage has probably been in Parliament more than Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Yvette Cooper et al. Over the last 6 or 7 months. Look, thanks for your call, Paul. Many thanks indeed. Let's just go to a quick voice note. Sean wants to talk about the economy.
I don't see how these politicians can say we've got more money in our pocket when quite clearly they haven't. My rent's gone up, my council tax is going up, my water bills are going to go up, my gas bills are going to go up. So where's all this extra money coming from? These people are absolute morons, mate. There is nothing good that I can say about them. This Labour Party, they're supposed to represent people like me, working class people, but let me tell you, mate, they don't represent me. I loathe them.
Well, look, Sean passionately talks a lot of sense there, doesn't he? He feels that he should be the sort of person that is represented by the Labour Party, the party of the working person, and he doesn't feel such. And I think that probably reflects what lots of you think with regard to, yes, the cost of living, council tax, of course, going up. Angela Rayner has just sanctioned a 10% increase across Britain. So if councils want to increase their council tax by 10%, they can. And that doesn't really seem like it meets the pledge from Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves from May and June last year, which was not only would you be better off under Labour, but council tax would not go up. Sounds like a bit of a fib to me. OK, look, when we come back after this break, we're going to be talking to Dr Alan Mendoza, who's an executive, or the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. We're going to be talking about this pro-Palestinian activist thing where, as October the 7th was unfolding, these guys were already lobbying the police because they wanted to be out on the streets campaigning against Israel as Israeli people were being slaughtered and taken kidnapped. Unbelievable. Back after this.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. I'm Russell Quirk. It's 10:40. I'm here till 1 o'clock in for Alex Phillips. Let's talk to Dr Alan Mendoza now, friend of the show and of Talk generally, of course, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, hi. Good morning. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Let's talk about this story that has broken as a consequence, it seems, of a Freedom of Information request regarding...
Yeah, I'm just moving it back, yeah.
Yeah, just regarding the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, PSC, who apparently, as Israelis were being taken hostage and being slaughtered on October the 7th, they literally, at that time, were lobbying the police, talking about wanting to have an anti-Israeli protest a few days later, not wasting any time. It's been described as ghoulish, actually, Alan. What sort of individual, as they're watching on the news this atrocity unfolding in front of them, thinks, I know what I'll do. I'll ring the Metropolitan Police and see if I can protest against the country that is the country of those victims, and I'll do that now. What sort of ghouls are these people?
Well, I think your viewers are sensible enough to realise that what is going on here is people who just hate Israel. That's the only purpose of what they're doing. Fancy coming into a discussion when you're starting to see people being murdered and then suggest that you should protest against that country of the people who are being murdered, the civilians who are being killed by terrorists.
Yeah.
I think, you know, your listeners, your viewers are going to know exactly what sort of people they are. And what they're really about. And it isn't to do anything with Palestinians and more to do with hatred and trying to destroy Israel in that sort of way. And I think, you know, their actions speak louder than any words they could ever say to the contrary.
Well, I mean, it's hideous. It's more than sinister. Let me read you some of this story. So at 12:50 p.m. On the day of the 2023 terror attack, that's October the 7th, while it was still ongoing, I mean, literally, you know, those hideous Hamas terrorists parachuting out of the sky, murdering people at a music festival, taking hostages, as that was still happening, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign notified the Metropolitan Police that they intended to hold a protest. A PSC organiser told the police over the phone at that time, again, while the atrocity was unfolding on our screens, that the group planned to march through London on the following Saturday. That's what a Freedom of Information request is revealed. I mean, this is absolutely hideous, isn't it? I mean, what a horrendous insensitivity. And I guess, look, they didn't realise that this would come out, I suppose, but it does tell us all we need to know, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, once again, they have given in words what they meant, what they wanted, what they aspired to, what they intended to do. And none of it was to do with solidarity with Palestinians, and all of it was to do with solidarity, clearly, with the murderers of Israeli civilians. I mean, how awful that while that was going on, this is what enters people's minds. Not compassion for those who'd been killed, not compassion for the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding in the Hamas attack in Israel, but rather this approach towards actually, you know, sort of suggesting that there should be a march. At that point, remember, there'd been nothing but attacks on Israelis in somehow, and linking that to the Palestinian cause. I mean, what an appalling thing to have had happen.
Yeah, and Alan, should we remind ourselves that I think that first protest on the following weekend, so October the 14th, was, I think, the time that we started to see, again, the ghoulishness, the insensitivity, the outrageous behaviour of some of those protesters, not all, but some of those protesters, whereby, you know, we heard chants, for instance, of from the river to the sea. So again, only a few days after many Israelis have been slaughtered or taken hostage, you've got this mob, and they are a mob, shouting basically for more Israeli slaughter. ISIS flags being unfurled at Trafalgar Square, things being said and shouted and displayed, you know, things like the Star of David with a swastika painted across it. I mean, these are things that we all witnessed on social media, and if not the mainstream media, because of course the mainstream media, the BBC included, spent several weeks before they would even label the atrocities by Hamas as terrorism. Let's remind ourselves of exactly what was going on. And these guys, the PSC, the so-called Palestinian Supporters Club, whatever they want to name themselves, doubled down.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, they claim to be the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign. If the solidarity you're trying to achieve here is to praise terrorism, I'm not sure that's solidarity in any way, shape or form. It doesn't help the Palestinian people. It certainly doesn't help the Israeli people. It's a ridiculous misnomer. And as you've quite rightly pointed out, the action spoke louder than the words. The very fact that this was a protest that was occurring at the very early stage here, when the Israelis had not responded in the slightest to what had happened, and yet already there were people on the streets, you know, sort of singing hate slogans, trying to make the point that they had always wanted to point, which is that really this is about destroying Israel, not about helping Palestinians. And when you have that on London streets, you have to be very concerned and wonder what sort of people are really driving this cause, and what sort of people were driving the cause for the whole 15, 16 months that we've seen those protests on the streets of London. Of course, there are people who are genuinely moved by the idea of, you know, trying to support Palestinians. You know, we're not talking about these people. We're talking about the people actually organising the rallies, who who clearly, from this very early indication, did not have clean motives in what they were trying to do.
Well, when you say we should be concerned, I mean, most right-minded people certainly were, but it doesn't seem that the Metropolitan Police were particularly concerned, because they stood idly by allowing this. And if you remember, in subsequent protests, you had pro-Israeli protesters that were then being arrested for unfurling Israeli flags. Yet Palestinian flags, and worse, were clearly visibly on display without the Metropolitan Police doing anything about it at all. It was the beginning of this whole conversation that we've had many, many times on this show since then, of the whole two-tier policing thing, which has, of course, escalated more and more and more over the last few months.
Yeah, exactly, and that is the key point here. What we saw actually in the last example of this a couple of weekends ago, when the Metropolitan Police did get their act together, they were able to do large-scale arrests and stop the protesters from trying to achieve what they wanted, which was clearly to disrupt the lives of Jewish citizens in London, because they wanted to hold marches by synagogues. Now, the reality is this should have happened at the start, not the end of this process. Yes. It should have taken 16 months to get to the obvious stage here, to say that something was wrong here and that there are other ways you could protest if you wanted to, than by inconveniencing your fellow citizens, as well as all those slogans, etc. And in reality, the police have got a lot of questions to answer. We know that. As you said, it started a long conversation about two-tier policing, which obviously still isn't over. But what the police have shown us is that they were able to use the powers that they at various points suggested they didn't have a couple of weeks ago to shut down those protests.
They seem to have them when it comes to certain demographics. So if it's the likes of St George's Day protests and what some would call patriotic protests, they use those powers with abandon. But when it comes to certain other members of society, not so much. Let's just talk quickly before you go about these Trump sanctions on the International Criminal Court, as we're on the subject. What do you make of this? This is Donald Trump effectively saying that members of the International Criminal Court that called for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and his defence minister, that he's going after them, and effectively, if they have any US interest, particularly economically, like bank accounts, he's going to freeze them.
Yeah, absolutely, and Donald Trump is right about this. The ICC's behaved disgracefully in recent months in its sort of kangaroo court persecution of Israel, which is not a signatory to the ICC treaty, and should not be under its jurisdiction because of that, but also because the ICC is a court of last resort. It is a court of last resort who has to step in when domestic systems fail. Now, the Israeli political and judicial system is very robust. The Israelis have held numerous politicians and others to account for various alleged abuses of power over the years. The idea that the Israeli legal system requires an international criminal court to intervene is for the birds. And what's happened here is a naked power grab by this court, which is trying to virtue signal to the world. It's crossed its boundaries. The Americans are quite right to say if it's crossed their boundaries there, they could well cross their boundaries with issues that the Americans are concerned with. The Americans are also, let's not forget, not signatories. And as a result, the Americans are quite right to say if you're going to play against the rules, we are going to force you back towards the rules by sanctioning you. It's the right thing to do. Whether the court listens is another matter, but in reality, this is what needed to happen some time ago, and now, only now, do we see a US president come forward ready to exert the full arsenal of America's ability to force justice to be done properly, and hopefully this will have the required effect.
Yes, and a president with the guts to do it. Dr. Ana Mendoza, as ever, thank you very much indeed, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. We're going to take a break, then we're going to talk about Lego bricks. I said bricks. Back after this.
thing that I find troubling, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Kevin, is that, you know, when the police were initially asked about this, they said, we're not going to investigate it because nobody's complained. And then, a day later, when obviously people did complain, they said, oh, we're not going to investigate it because apparently it's out of time. Well, you know, why didn't they just say that the first time around?
Well, I think it's really important that everybody's treated equally before the law.
Yeah.
And we saw this action taken against certain individuals within our party, Boris and others, which people will have different views upon.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. I'm Russell Quirk. This is Talk, and let's talk about Lego. That's not something that you thought we'd be talking about on this channel. Quite an inoffensive thing, you would think, unless you step on it, of course, which is one of the worst experiences you can ever have. But no, not so inoffensive, apparently, according to the Science Museum, who say that it could be seen as distinctly anti-LGBT. And we're going to find out exactly why now when we speak to Kate Barker, who's the CEO of the LGB Alliance. Kate, Lego, offensive, who knew?
Oh, well, exactly. I mean, apparently, so I've had a look at this, and apparently it's an example of how heteronormative language influences...
What? Heteronormative?
Heteronormative.
Is that a word?
Heteronormative language.
There's
going to be a lot of words like this. And how it influences technology, because Lego's got the male bit, the sticky up bit,
the
and
sticky
the female
pointy bits,
which is the whole. And apparently that's sort of
influence
how technology develops.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if you think that analogy through, because this comes from the Gender and Sexuality Network at the Science Museum. If you think that analogy through, if you had non-binary Lego, it wouldn't work at all because it wouldn't stick together.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, look, you know what we should do, Kate, is to coin the phrase lesbian Lego on the basis that definitely wouldn't work. I mean, how would that stick together?
Yeah, well, I know.
That's something that's now festering in your mind for the rest of the day, isn't it?
Well, I think it is, and I'm glad we're talking about all the issues that really matter. But
well, I just want to take a break from the hapless economy that we're faced with. So the Lego story, Ted here, our producer in charge, said, let's do that just so that we don't all end up being completely depressed for the rest of the day.
Well, I tell you what, though, it does point to something a little bit more serious, which is the fact that the Science Museum has got a Gender and Sexuality Network, and it's a committee of...
But Kate,
it's a committee of people, apparently, to make LGBTQ plus people feel more included. I would suggest it is a committee of dimwits who the museum probably put them together and hope this will keep them out of trouble.
But why does the Science Museum need to be thinking about gender? I mean, when has science ever had anything to do with gender or vice versa, apart from biology, which I guess you could loosely say is science? I mean,
it's never had anything to do with it. In fact, it's the absolute antithesis of it. And museums and galleries have documented homosexuality really well and extensively because homosexuality is real and has existed forever. But gender identity is a new thing. And it's really wrong to create this false narrative, to be essentially revisionist about any history in science and technology and pretend that it's influenced the way that technology has developed. And it wouldn't really matter if it weren't for the fact that the biggest audience for places like the Science Museum is parties of school kids who are being fed this nonsense. And it's just wrong to feed them this false narrative, however silly it is.
Do you think, and it is silly, do you think overtly woke parents now are going to kind of cross Lego off their modern progressive kids' Christmas lists?
Well, I think so. I mean, it could be it's so offensive if it's heteronormative, obviously.
But hang on, sorry. What else do we think then in the same vein might be offensive? I mean, plugs? I mean, as in the plug that goes into your wall. I mean, presumably they're anti-LGBT.
I think they sound transphobic, and I think you ought to be careful.
Well, I'm throwing around this glibly because, of course, this is a serious subject, Kate, isn't it? No, it's not.
The trouble is, this kind of the exhibition is called seeing things queerly, which is a bit of a giveaway, which is you look at you look at history and you look at science and you look at the solid established facts of the world about how the world works and how we exist. And then you see them through a queer lens, which is essentially a distortion of reality. And when you present it somewhere like the Science Museum, parents think, I'm going to take my kids along there and everything I see, there's going to be scientific and it's going to be fact. So it's quite pernicious to be able to include, through a queer lens. Most of it is just daft. I've looked through the things that are in the trail. They're ridiculous. There are things like 2 stuffed chickens, and a thing about violet cough syrup that they've sort of tenuously pulled together as all being something to do with queer.
What, and these things in some way are offensive, Kate, are they?
No, they're well, it depends.
It depends how mad you are, whether you think they're offensive or not, I suppose, yeah.
They're reflections of the influence of queer people, I'm not quite sure what they are, throughout society and in the development of technology. So it's all very confusing.
But just so that people listening understand, we're not making this stuff up. This is a genuine thing, which is called the Gender and Sexuality Network at the Science Museum, right? So the Science Museum, for some reason, has a gender and sexuality network. I mean, a big question mark there over the reason for that. And then, presumably, Kate, at some expense, have put together this guide, yes, as you say, seeing things queerly, where I suppose if you squint and put one hand over one eye, you could possibly see everything in either an LGBT or a gender context, couldn't you? We have to ask ourselves, I'm going to ask this on behalf of all the people that are listening to this, what is the point of this?
I think the point is to conflate gender, which is a social construct and which is new and which lots of people make their living out of and which informs lots of our thinking, with the reality of homosexuality. So it's offensive to me to call it the LGBTQ plus network because I think those two things are in opposition.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's valuable for children to see a different perspective on things, but if that perspective is so skewed and it's so ideologically driven, it doesn't belong in a publicly funded museum, particularly not one with science in its name.
Well, I think someone should do an FOI to find out how much this nonsense actually cost.
I think that's a great idea.
Kate Barker, well, I'll leave that to you. Kate Barker, CEO of the LGB Alliance, thank you very much indeed for talking sense. We're going to be talking sense after the break with Sean Woodward as well. We're going to be talking about, again, stagflation, the economy, Rachel Reeves and other things. So, yeah, back to being a little bit serious. Let us know what you think. 0344 499 1000. I'm Russell Quirk, back right after this.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. Russell Quirk in for Alex Phillips. I'm going to talk to Sean Woodward in a second, who's a former Northern Ireland Secretary and Labour MP. But first, another Sean. You'll remember this just from a little while ago, a voice note that we had, which we think was so good, we're going to play it twice.
I don't see how these politicians can say we've got more money in our pocket when quite clearly they haven't. My rent's gone up, my council tax is going up, my water bills are going to go up, my gas bills are going to go up. So where's all this extra money coming from? These people are absolute morons, mate. There is nothing good that I can say about this Labour Party. They're supposed to represent people like me, working class people, but let me tell you, mate, they don't represent me. I loathe them.
So that was Sean voice note. Now we're going to talk to Sean Woodward. Sean, welcome to the show. Sean, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I don't know if you managed to hear that. Your namesake there, Sean, describes himself as a working class individual. He says the Labour Party should be representing him. He doesn't believe so. In fact, he went as far as to call the current front bench morons. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I understand how angry people are feeling, but let's remember this did not start with the Labour government being elected last year. We inherited a hell of a mess, and that hell of a mess was created by the Tories over 14 years. So this is about clearing up 14 years of mismanagement of the economy, mismanagement of the National Health Service. That doesn't mean to say I don't hear how angry people are. Of course they're angry, and I've got huge sympathy with that.
But Sean, do you really expect us to accept that when the economy was recovering in the first part of 2024, so we had GDP increasing, inflation down, interest rates starting to be cut, unemployment steady, that, like it or not, that recovery then was reversed within 3 or 4 months of the current government's tenure by way of what can only be described as a catastrophic budget, a budget that the Bank of England even are saying was so catastrophic that they've now revised the growth forecast for Britain during this year down from a paltry, pathetic 1.5% to an even more pathetic 0.75%. They directly attributed that to Rachel Reeves's budget. So it's got nothing to do with the Conservatives.
First of all, let's remember the Bank of England did not say it was a catastrophic budget. The Bank of England has revised the growth forecast, but the connection that you've made between the two, Russell, is not one that was made by the Governor of the Bank of England yesterday. So that's entirely misleading. Let's also remember that the Conservative Party brought about the inflation that led to the interest rates rising, which has crippled the economy in the process. Yes, they were beginning to come down last year in terms of inflation, but only from nearly a double-figure number that happened under the Tories. The consequence of that has been the most enormous deficit, a crisis in public spending, and there was no choice but for whoever was in government to address that or let the country go bankrupt. So blaming the Labour government for the Tory party mess is first of all unfair. That doesn't mean that people aren't hurting. And the problem is here that, forgive me, commentators like yourself, in forgetting the damage that was done to the economy by Liz Truss, for example, by the Tory party year after year, has to now be put right. And the idea that that is pain-free is crazy. The problem is that what you're not doing when you make the kind of commentary you're doing, Russell, is understanding just how much it hurts ordinary people to be paying for what the Tories did to the economy. And fixing it is not a pain-free process. And suggesting that somehow the Labour Party in government is responsible for the pain now is to forget what happened for 14 years of irresponsible government by the Tories. Now, that still doesn't mean that we don't need to do more. That still doesn't mean that when we see the growth forecast cut in half to 0.75%, which, by the way, is exactly the same as the rest of Europe, that still doesn't mean we don't want to do more. And that's why the Prime Minister is doing everything to try and get growth back in the economy. Let's remember that growth and productivity in the economy in the last 5 years fell dramatically, not under Labour, under the Tories. Turning that round is very, very hard.
Sean, I'm not sure that comparing our financial economic performance to Europe is very helpful, given that France are about to enter recession, Germany are about to enter recession. So I'm not sure that's a particularly helpful comparison. How long are the Labour Party going to keep blaming...
It is helpful because
how long are the Labour Party going to keep blaming the Tories for the ills of the economy now that they've been in power, well, nearly a year?
No, first of all, forgive me, the difference between July the 4th and now is 6 months, not a year, Russell. Let's try and get some grip. Let's get some grip on the... Excuse me. July, August, September, October, November, December, January. We've had just over 6 months. Let's not get too carried...
Sean, we're in February.
Yeah, the beginning of February, Russell. Look, forgive me.
The election was at the beginning of July.
Nonsense.
No. The nonsense is Labour apparatchiks like you peddling the same nonsense and rubbish where you won't listen to the public. People like Sean in the voice note just now that are working people that have supported Labour all their lives. They can see, they're not economists, they're not mathematicians. They can see that adding a £40 billion tax burden to the economy on the basis that you cannot tax your way to growth is clearly, when you start persecuting business owners, wealth creators, entrepreneurs and so on, and pensioners and waspy women, that is not conducive with fixing the economy that, yes, the Conservatives didn't leave in a particularly good place. But for you to be lamenting, again, the same old Labour trope that we hear from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer every single week in Parliament, that it's the Tories' fault. Enough. The Labour Party are now in government. We want to hear what you're going to do about it to make things better. Clearly, Rachel Reeves, unqualified as she is making this economy worse. The data is clear for us all to see, Sean, and the Bank of England have said exactly the same thing. So you've got to take action and start being positive. Start cutting taxes. Now, I know that's not in your ideology as a Labour Party, but that's the only way that this economy is going to grow, isn't it?
Sorry, Russell, so you would allow the deficit to grow even more, would you?
No, what I would do is cut taxes so that would increase growth, increase employment.
Do you finance...
And as a consequence...
Russell,
have you heard of the Laffer curve?
Sorry, this is basic...
No, basic economics is the Laffer curve.
Russell, this is basic economics.
Yes.
No.
Look up the Laffer curve,
I
Sean.
absolutely respect what the gentleman... I absolutely respect what the gentleman just said to us. And I think if you listen to what he said, and I listen to what he said, your prescription, and let's take your prescription straight head on. How do you finance tax cuts? That leaves you with a larger gap in public service spending to finance. How do you finance that, Russell?
Surely, can I answer you?
Either do it
you're
as
asking
we
me,
have done.
You're asking me a question. Yeah. I'm going to answer it. And with respect, sir, it really worries me that you think that increasing taxes increases tax take. There is a thing called the Laffer curve, which every person that does GCSE or A-level economics is taught about as one of the first things in that economics course, which is if you cut taxes, you increase the tax take because it incentivises people, because you don't get one millionaire every 45 minutes leaving Britain and taking their money and their tax with them. Have you heard of the Laffer curve, Sean?
Of course I have, and I don't think we get anywhere by insulting each other, by asking what each of us has heard of. What we're trying to do here is genuinely answer the question which Sean posed earlier on, which is how you help that person and how you help everybody else in that position. Dismissing the idea that Britain has got the most enormous deficit and gap between tax take and public spending is something you have to address. The idea that you address that gap by simply cutting the tax rate. On that basis, Russell, why didn't the Tories manage, when they cut taxes, to eliminate the deficit altogether? And quoting economic cycle curves as the answer is not actually going to deal with it, because it didn't do it under the Tories. And what we're trying to do is something different. How do you address the problems in the National Health Service when you've got 8 million people, which we inherited, waiting to see doctors and have treatment? You just say, look, I'm afraid your answer to that is cut taxes. That's going to help the health service. Russell, do you really believe that you help people like Sean by literally tearing the National Health Service to pieces? Is that really your answer to the problem?
Where do you get tearing the health service to pieces from? Sorry, who's suggesting that?
Well, if you don't increase the amount of money that goes to the health service, how do you deal with cutting waiting times?
Wow. So
and if you don't actually increase taxes in order to fund that.
So, Sean, you think that the health service, given that it now has more money than it's ever had, so £200 billion is the NHS budget, there's more money in that NHS per person than there's ever been, and that we've also heard from the Bank of England, and this brings us very, very nicely to the other point that Andrew Bailey made yesterday, that is our public sector is bloated. We have 500,000 more public sector employees, including in the NHS, yet the public sector, those employees on average are 8% less productive. So your logic, which is let's just raise taxes and chuck a load of money at the public sector, clearly is not the answer.
No, it's not.
Because that's already been done. And when you talk about the Conservatives cutting taxes, Sean, hang on. Let me just finish my point. When you talk about the Conservative Party over the last 4 or 5 years cutting taxes, they did not do that. They increased national insurance. They increased corporation tax. The last government, I mean, were more closely aligned with you as a Labour Party member than me as a Conservative. They were not proper Conservatives at all. So we can't use the Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak government as a barometer in this conversation at all, because they weren't proper Conservatives, as you well know.
Russell, you've just quoted, let's deal with your first of your points, Andrew Bailey, and what you described rightly as the bloated public sector. Let's now actually take what Andrew Bailey said in context, not out of context, which you've done. Andrew Bailey was quoting what happened to the public sector during COVID and following COVID. The Labour Party was not in government when the public sector grew in the way that it did and became increasingly underproductive as it did. Question to you, Russell. Of that percentage, that fall of 10% in productivity in the public sector, what percentage of that took place under the Tories? The answer is nearly all of it.
Yeah, I think,
that's
Sean,
what we've got to reverse.
What I was rebutting was your belief that just sticking more money into the public sector is the solution. It clearly isn't, because that was done under the last government and the government before that, and the public sector in efficiency terms and outcomes has got worse. Just stay there a second, Sean, if you don't mind. We've got a voice note from Tristan that wants to comment on the conversation that you and I are having right now.
The fact is, this is to do with Labour. Labour have brought in ridiculous policies with energy, with net zero. That's just one example. Second example is they've done a disastrous budget where they just stifled growth. They stopped growth in its tracks with the insanity of putting up national insurance for businesses. And the other thing is they just keep giving money away. Like the Chagos Islands is just a prime example, 18 billion, the money they gave to the public sector. I mean, they have to take accountability for the decisions that they've made in a very short space of time.
Sean, how do you respond to Tristan?
Well, I'm listening to what Tristram says. And first of all, I think, of course, we have to take responsibility for the decisions that are made. Of course, we have to take responsibility for the last 6 or 7 months, or even 8 months on your calculation, Russell. But what most matters here is that we take the right decisions for the long term to turn this around. Now, you and I may differ. You're a Conservative, I am not. But what I believe it is right to do, for example, on net zero, is to do something about what is happening to our climate. And if we don't recognize the need to get net zero there, if we say it doesn't matter, then what is that we're leaving for our children and our grandchildren? And is that really responsible for you to say net zero doesn't matter? I think it does matter. I think the commitment to the long term, I think the commitment, for example, to weaning Britain off fossil fuels, to building the nuclear power stations, the alternative energy solutions for the long term, is the right thing to do. Now, you may disagree with the particular individual issues that Ed Miliband may talk about as the energy secretary. But if we don't deal with building nuclear power and alternatives to fossil fuels, then because of the decisions that have been made over previous decades, we will be stuck with a reliance on our energy supplies from outside of the UK. So I think it's right that we do something about rebuilding our energy sources in the UK. The problem we're dealing with now is the failure of all previous governments, but including that of the Tories for the last 14 years, to prepare for this. But that does mean enormous pain for people. And of course, it's felt by those who have the least. And that's why I think people like Tristram and Sean this morning, I'm not going to disagree with them. I think we in government have got to listen to what they're saying. We've got to understand how they're feeling. We've got to understand what it means for a chancellor to make these incredibly painful changes to the economy. And that isn't about saying that we don't care. And I think it would be a real mistake to think that anybody doesn't care. Of course you care. I care. You and I disagree about how we would do it. But what really matters here is that we all get in there and we contribute ideas to making this happen. I think that we've got to recognize that we had to find the money from somewhere. We had to balance the books. The books were not balanced. Your solution is to cut taxes, but if you cut taxes, you'd have to make even bigger cuts to public spending, which would mean even bigger cuts in things like the health service. Now, I agree with you, Russell, that simply throwing money at public services doesn't make better public services. That's why Wes Streeting is demanding enormous reform change inside the NHS at the same time as funding the junior doctors' pay increase.
And Sean,
maybe you wouldn't have given the junior doctors the money.
No, I certainly wouldn't give them.
Going to get us better productivity in the health service by them being on strike.
I certainly wouldn't acquiesce to the unions as Keir Starmer's done by way of giving 22% to trained drivers, junior doctors and so on unnecessarily, no, which of course in itself not only was unaffordable but in itself fuels inflation. What would you say, Sean, to those that are listening to this, whether they be a pensioner in a cold lounge or whether they be a waspy woman or a business owner in hospitality, for instance, that's seen the double whammy of 1.2% increase in national insurance contributions or indeed a huge rise in the minimum wage? What would you say to those individuals when they also see that we're about to give £18 billion to Mauritius, which is the GDP of Mauritius, as we heard earlier on, to give away something that we already own and to pay them to take it, when £22 billion, which ironically is exactly the same as the so-called black hole that the OBR can't find, by the way, what would you say to those people when they see that £22 billion going to carbon capture at the behest of Ed Miliband is something that even Dale Vince says is a tin pot, ridiculous approach because that system doesn't work? And how do you reconcile Labour's policy on freezing pensioners, and some will die by Labour's own numbers, when we're giving away £18 billion to Mauritius and £22 billion on a lunatic carbon capture project? How do you think that pensioners should reconcile those things? Do you think they should be happy because there's a bigger picture involved, as you're saying?
Come on, Russell. Asking me if I think pensioners should be happy for freezing to death.
Answer the question.
Is it no? No, but that's an insulting question.
No, it's not. No. Hang on. If you're a 70-year-old pensioner in a cold house in Newcastle right now, and you're watching on the news that £18 billion is being given to Mauritius to take something that we own, to bribe them to take something that they have no business owning, how do you feel, do you think, as a pensioner, knowing that you can't afford to put any money in the meter and heat your home this winter? Answer the question, Sean.
Well, of course they're not going to be happy. I'm not happy. I think it's appalling that we have the prospect of a Britain in which there is anybody, let alone a pensioner, over the age of 70 who cannot afford to turn their heating on. But let's remember, Russell, you don't like hearing this. We are in this mess because of the mess of the last government. And it's been clearing up that mess that led to some very, very difficult decisions. I have to say, if you want to compare the idea of 18 billion going to Mauritius compared with the idea of funding the winter fuel allowance, of course, if you make that straight, crude comparison, of course it doesn't stack up.
It's a real
but
comparison.
Then actually, if you look at some of the measures that were conducted by your government up until July of
mine, they're not mine.
Year,
I'm a Conservative with a small
none of
C.
those things stack up.
Sean, they're not my government. I'm a Conservative with a small C, but I'm a proper Conservative. Sean, look, we've got to go. This has been fun. I hope we can do this again because, yeah, what a fantastic debate. And it's got the phone lines going. So join in, 0344 499 1000. Do what a lot of people are doing and give us a call. Let us know what you think about that conversation. I was right, of course, wasn't I? 0344 499 1000. Back after this, maybe with some of those calls.
The other day, an activity session being run by the Royal Museums in Greenwich. They're running drag aerobic sessions for children of all ages. And having looked at the advertising material, it looks like softcore pornography. Another example, King's College London, meant to be one of the best educational institutes of the country, has just appointed a quote-unquote asexual activist as a research fellow.
Great.
Whatever the hell that means.
I mean, why are they bothering?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, it does seem that Sean Woodward has got you rather motivated this morning on 0344 499 1000. Lots and lots and lots of calls coming in. I wonder who will agree with him. Not many of you by the looks of him. Let's talk to Tarquin, who is somewhere in London. Want to talk about Sean Woodward. Tarquin, welcome.
Good morning. Well, you were, to answer your question, absolutely right. That gentleman you just had on is a moron, a cretin.
Steady.
Apparently, Sean Anthony Woodward joined as a Conservative MP in 1997, and he did a turncoat 180 and became Labour 2 years later. What a traitor to whatever the wind was blowing. And it was a Labour government at the time, and he saw the Tories in decline. Oh, no, don't think he saw where the trough was there, do you?
And Tarquin, did you think that that is a kind of indication of what we would now call the uni party, where you actually can't tell a Labour politician or a Conservative politician apart these days?
Exactly. They are wearing the same cloth. It's like what's blue and red mixed? It's sort of purpley. Yeah, he's purple, isn't he? He's one of those purple helmet brigade. So we need to completely disregard anything he just said to you. You were completely in the right. You totally destroyed him. He was struggling like I've never heard before. And he completely ignored the whole of what Labour did at the back end of 2010 when Austerity 1 came in, didn't he? He completely disregarded.
Well, and also
more pain for the people.
Well, thank you for saying.
For the people, we've had that.
I love your passion, Tarquin, I have to say. Yes, and look, let's also not forget the 1970s. I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember the 70s when we actually did have a socialist government like this one. I wouldn't go as far as to say that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were socialist. I mean, they're actually quite business friendly. And until the crash that Gordon Brown assisted with in 2008-9, they actually didn't do a terrible job. But this lot, Starmer and Rachel Reeves, are more reminiscent of the likes of James Callaghan and Dennis Healey. Dennis Healey, of course, the Chancellor back in the 70s, that very nearly had to go to the International Monetary Fund with our cap in his hand to bail us out. We are heading directly in that direction again, aren't we?
We are, and as Jim Callaghan said at the time, crisis? What crisis? Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. It's the economy, stupid. Remember that as well. So no sympathy for Sean Woodward, lamenting the fact this is all the Tories' fault. And how long do you think that the Labour government can go on using the Conservatives as an excuse for their economic mismanagement?
Well, they will go on endlessly because it's the same trope that they use. Far right fads, it's the same thing. It's a little tropism of the far left Trotskyite globalists, what we're hearing, isn't it? And these people are just playing to the hymn sheet. Same old playbook, Russell. Same old crap. Ignore them. Idiots.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to see, I'm afraid, in future spring statements and budgets, that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are just going to double down. So we're going to see even higher taxes because they're going to be scratching their heads, bewildered, Tarquin, thinking, why is the economy not balancing? Why is it not adding up? We don't understand. They won't understand that wealth creators, entrepreneurs and business people, those that employ people, actually create this country's wealth. It doesn't come, I'm afraid, from the public sector because the public sector is public money that has already been given to them by taxpayers.
They need to read Wealth of Nations again if they haven't already read it, and suck it, just absorb it, and think that it's free market capitalism that works, and not crony stakeholder capitalism that Schwab and the WAF, which is a terrorist organisation, are peddling currently. We need to get rid of all that crap.
Do you think, Tarquin, that it was a little bit surprising that when I confronted Sean Woodward, who's a former Northern Ireland Secretary, so a former Cabinet Minister and Labour MP, he didn't acknowledge immediately that he knew what the Laffer curve was, which just, for those at the back, and I'm not an economist, by the way, but I will just try and explain it very briefly, which is if you keep raising taxes, the extreme example is what happened in the 1970s, where income tax at the highest rate went to 90%. And guess what happened to all of the movie stars and the entrepreneurs and those with wealth? They all migrated elsewhere, and they took their money and their tax with them. If you reduce taxes, a bit like Thatcher did in the early to mid-80s with corporation and income tax, because people feel more invigorated and sentiment improves, guess what happens to the tax take? It goes up. Tarquin, you were brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go to another caller.
Thank you, Russell.
Pleasure, mate. Thanks. Call again, please. Let's speak to Stuart in Wigan. Stuart, what do you think?
I think I am absolutely sick to death of listening to these lying, spineless, scumbags Labour. I mean, I was sick of it with Conservatives as well. But you know what? They had other problems as well. But they're talking about public spending and then giving massive pay increases to them and increasing workforce more. And it's just an absolute load of rubbish. Everything about Labour, they're just traitors, a lot of them.
And do you mind me saying, Stuart, if I listened to you in the pub, I'd be saying to myself, that guy votes Labour.
No. Well, I was brought up voting Labour. I remember the 70s as well. My dad was a fireman. So we all went through it. Do you know what I mean? So I remember the 70s too.
You're right there, Stuart. I might let you go, actually, if you're going to have a coffee fit. Look, Stuart, let's move on, because we've got about 400 million voice notes to get through. Look, seriously, Stuart, in Wigan, ex-Labour voter, never going to vote for them again by the sounds of it. Wise words, thank you. Let's go to a little compilation of voice notes that we seem to have accumulated over the last half an hour or so.
Sean Woodward, like most members of the Labour Party, is economically illiterate.
Typical Labour minister, again, blaming the Tories. How long are we going to do this for?
The guy's economically illiterate.
And they keep blaming the Tories for it. I can't understand it. He's a moron.
Sean Woodward is just repeating the Labour mantra, tax and spend.
As per usual, Labour not wanting to answer any questions.
Wow, that was a compilation of just some of the voice notes that we've had. If you want to join in the party, by the way, which is... and I don't want it to be the anti-Sean Woodward party. Look, he's a Labour Party member. He's got every right to believe what he believes. Let's assume he does actually believe it, rather than it just being a line that he feels he's got to peddle. It's all the Tories' fault, and I suspect in 3 or 4 years' time, the Labour government will still be saying it's all the Tories' fault, even if we have gone to the International Monetary Fund to say, hey, there's no more money. Do you remember that note, Liam Byrne? There's no more money. Well, we're certainly heading in that direction again, aren't we? Join in 0344 499 1000. Give us a call. Send us a text on 87222. I'll be back after this. Phew.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. It's just become a very fast-moving show. Loads and loads and loads of interaction from you guys. Thank you very much indeed. Text, calls, voice notes, the whole thing. About, I guess, look, the whole, not Labour versus Conservative thing economically, but the fact that whichever party seems to be in power, they mismanage things and never actually acknowledge the problem. They just point fingers at each other and blame the previous party and so on. And I think, frankly, we are all sick of it. What we want is not just platitudes and lamenting and excuses. We want some action, and certainly the way out of a fragile economy as it was, albeit it was in its first stages of recovery and growth when Rishi Sunak handed over, perhaps prematurely, the keys to number 10 to Keir Starmer. We actually want to ensure that the economy is dealt with in such a way as to ensure growth, rather than Rachel Reeves just talking about it and saying the words growth, growth, growth over again, as if that is going to make all of the difference. Anyway, let's change gears a little. We're going to go across the Atlantic now. Let's talk about what's going on in the United States now, because talking of financial mismanagement is this incredible story of US Aid, which is this kind of this organisation which is funded by the US taxpayer that seems to have sent money to rather some odd places. Let me just give you an example before we go to Adam Coleman, who's going to join me in a minute from the New York Post. This has come directly from Caroline Leavitt, or Levitt, I think it's probably pronounced, who is the Donald Trump's new press secretary, who's absolutely incredibly good, by the way, and very entertaining if you can catch her on YouTube when she does her bits of press from the podium at the White House. She's uncovered and says that $1.5 million has been sent to advanced DEI in Serbia's workplaces. So in other words, Serbia's DEI quest, that's diversity, equity and inclusion, has been funded by the US taxpayer to the tune of $1.5 million. $70,000 for a production of a DEI musical in Ireland, and $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. Wow, this has got Kevin O'Sullivan written all over it, isn't it? Not the transgender bit, by the way, but the fact that I'm sure that when he's on later, he will be all over this. This is absolutely outrageous, isn't it? Oh, and by the way, one more thing, $32,000 of US taxpayers' money spent on a transgender comic book in Peru. Adam Coleman from the New York Post, do you think that's money well spent?
Of course not.
It was a loaded question.
And actually, from that list that you gave, you don't have the money that they gave towards the BBC.
Yes.
The BBC acknowledged about 8% of their budget comes from USAID.
How much was that, Adam? Do you remember the dollar amount?
I believe it was like it was either 1.2 or 2 million. It's something in that range.
Wow.
Coming from USAID. Now, for most Americans, if you were to look at USAID just on the surface and you ask the question, what do they do? You would think some sort of humanitarian work. Well, if that's the case, then why are they giving money to Politico for subscriptions?
And that was $8 million, Adam, wasn't it? $8 million to Politico, which is a left-leaning media organisation. I mean, can I join the dots here? Is that simply funding political media organisations politically so that they say the right thing in terms of their influence, their message that accords, therefore, with the Democrats and their ideology? So, in other words, were these bribes to the media?
Not necessarily bribes. See, I think what we're uncovering is that it's not a, hey, do this for me and I'll help hook you up. I think it's a collusion. It's something where they're automatically working with each other. I look at the pandemic. Why was everyone saying the exact same talking point? And it's because they're all going to the same experts. They all believe the same things. The journalist who just recently doxed one of the Doge team members, well, she has strong ties with USAID. She has strong ties with the State Department.
And Adam, just explain for our listeners here, Doge. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful new creation by Elon Musk. Would you mind just explaining it to us, what Doge is?
Yeah, Department of Government Efficiency, which technically isn't a real department. It's just a title that they're going by. They're the ones who are being tasked to go from department to department to look at the books and see where money is going. So that's how we're finding out this financial information. And what's happened, especially coming from the Democrats, what they've done is attacked Elon as far as his character, but they've also been trying to dox the engineers and the people who are helping to look at the books. And you have to ask yourself, the people who aren't trying to defend those numbers, but attack the people who are uncovering the corruption, these are people who are corrupt. These are people who are part of the system. And it's not just the politicians, the Democrats, but it's also the media apparatus who are acting as attack dogs going after these people.
And Adam, can you define, I mean, you said corruption a couple of times there. Can you define what you mean by corruption here? I mean, do you think this is just woke, misspent, misplaced money that has been spent by US aid on, well, not, I suppose on behalf of the US taxpayer, but it's certainly US taxpayer dollars? Or do you think there's something more going on here? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting there's far, far more going on. You know, Mike Benz, who's a former State Department official, he's been talking about how the State Department and the CIA utilizes US aid to actually do covert operations, right? So the CIA has to get presidential approval to do certain covert operations, but if they utilize US aid and use the money from them and set up shop in some foreign nation, then they don't have to get permission to do that. And it's one of these kind of open secrets in DC that the State Department has been utilizing US aid as a go-between.
So it's a slush
there's
fund.
a lot more.
It's a slush
yeah,
fund.
It's a slush fund.
And do you think there are, and again, we need to tread carefully here, but I have to ask the question because people listening to this will be thinking this. Do you think that this corruption, this US aid profligacy, do you think it has enriched people unjustifiably as individuals?
Individuals and organizations. So if we were to look at what happened when it came to BLM, what happened when it came to all these NGOs, how come suddenly there are these NGOs popping up all over the country with these protests? Why is the media all in unison? Could it be ideological? Maybe. Or could it be that someone is funding this? You know, we have to start asking these particular questions. And the more that we dig, the more we find that USAID was the go-between, the slush fund, as you put it, to finance just about everything that is anti-American that's been happening here in the United States and even abroad. And the woke stuff, to be honest with you, is just a way to cause some sort of influence elsewhere.
So
it's just causing uprising.
Or Adam, it's just cover, right? So the wokeness of this is just cover. So I know it looks ridiculous, and some of these things obviously genuinely are ridiculous in terms of sending money to, you know, Colombia for a transgender opera. I mean, it's unbelievable that could even be. Someone had to sign that off, right? So someone within the USAID organisation from that slush fund, from that pot, actually had to sign that off. Big question though, Donald Trump is now in his second term. Why didn't he do anything about this in his first term? Because this sounds like this has been going on for years.
That's a very good question. And it's hard for me to answer. The one thing I can say is after his assassination attempt, his demeanor is different and his determination is different. His approach is completely different. And maybe being removed from politics and you know, having more time to kind of figure out exactly what he would do and analyzing things. And I think he's admitted publicly, you know, when he first got into the White House, I think he was just as shocked as everybody else that he had won, but he didn't exactly know how to navigate. I think now he knows how to navigate. He knows exactly what to do. He knows how much time he has to do it.
But surely,
so
Adam,
that's why he's working.
This has everything to do with Elon Musk, doesn't it? The fact that he didn't have Elon Musk by his side in his first term and now he has. This is Musk's baby, isn't it, Doge?
Yes, Musk is a big part of it, but I think if it wasn't Musk, it would have been somebody else. I think this has been on the radar as far as shrinking the government, as far as going after the swamp. That was his initial promise in his original campaign, is to take down the swamp. And here we're finding out that this is the swamp's bank account. So wow. I think inevitably this is going to happen.
So just let me just repeat that. So USAID is the blob, the swamp's illicit bank account.
One of. I think we're going to figure out that it is one of. People keep talking about, oh, USAID is just a sliver, a fraction of the federal government's budget.
Well, it's 55 billion pounds, so $68 billion. Now, our budget here, so the UK, our budget is about £1 trillion a year. It's about 900 billion, I think, is what we spend as a country from a governmental point of view. What's the comparative budget for the US? I mean, several times that, obviously, and therefore, what is this as a percentage? I mean, it's small fry, but it's still 55 billion pounds of US taxpayers' money.
Exactly. I know that USAID is less than 1%, I can't remember the exact number, and I don't remember the total federal government budget. But that's actually the bigger point. If they're doing that with a small, relatively small budget of the federal government, what's the amount of waste that we'll see when we start getting into the Pentagon, right?
Yeah.
Which has admitted in multiple audits that they don't know where the money is, right? And so I think they are running scared. I think the Democrats, that's why they're standing outside of USAID panicking, thinking that regular people are going to rally next to them, next to these paid protesters that are with them.
What, not because they see the sanctity of USAID as important, but because they're worried about what's about to be uncovered?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you go after the people who are uncovering corruption, instead of talking about the corruption that they're uncovering, that tells you everything right there.
And this, look, as a columnist at the New York Post, I suspect you've probably written a lot about this, which is why we're talking to you. Do you think this could end up being the biggest corruption scandal the world has ever seen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Really? Yes, I think so. If Elon stays resilient, if Trump doesn't budge and keeps going from books to books, I think a lot of people are going to be shocked. I'm just as shocked as much that they're finding so far, and they're not even done.
Yeah. But this could be hundreds of billions of dollars. And kind of the final question, really, do you think that we should have a similar uncovering, a similar probe, a similar audit in Britain?
I think every government should. You know, when you're a taxpayer, your money is going towards the government with the hopes that it is going towards the very thing that they said it's going towards. And if everyone treats your money like it's someone else's money and not caring about it and spending your money like they're gambling addicts, like, this is a problem. And so we need to figure out where that money is going, who's been spending it, and why. And I would even go as far as saying prosecuting people if they're misappropriating funds.
I was going to say, Adam, I mean, people need to go to jail, right? If they're found guilty, of course. And it seems, I mean, look, nobody's on the hook yet, but I suspect that as part of this, it won't just be stopping payments, which I know Elon Musk and President Trump have done, and continue to uncover, as you call it, the corruption here. But it'll be people being on the hook within the government, the previous government, of course, under Biden, maybe Obama, maybe Trump's first term, and those individuals being held to account criminally. And that has to happen, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it would be unjust if that doesn't happen. And let's just say the phrase, we're looking at potential money laundering. So with all these weird programs that are going on, are they actually going towards programs, or is it a way to give money to outside hands for whatever particular reason?
When you say outside hands, do you think some of this money has found its way, let's not mention any names, but do you think this money has found its way into Congress people, senators, politicians' pockets?
Absolutely. What happens is they use NGOs, right, to say it is for a particular cause, and that money gets sent to them, and then they send that money to some sort of PAC, right, or a super PAC, right? So the money just moves from one hand to another hand, and ultimately to the ultimate destination. I mean, that's essentially what money laundering is. They're just using the federal government to do so.
Wow. Adam, this is an incredible story, and it's obviously going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And Elon Musk and President Trump clearly dogs with bones when it comes to getting to the root of this, because, of course, they're going to be the heroes of the story, which is exactly why they're doing this. And that was Adam Coleman, columnist at the New York Post. Fascinating and pretty scary. As I suggest, let's now replicate that in Britain. Let's have a look at the civil service and how much money they are spending of your money that perhaps they shouldn't have been. I'm Russell Quirk. Back after this to talk about Sick Note Britain.
the other day an activity session being run by the Royal Museums in Greenwich. They're running drag aerobic sessions for children of all ages, and having looked at the advertising material, it looks like softcore pornography. Another example, King's College London, meant to be one of the best educational institutes of the country, has just appointed a quote-unquote asexual activist as a research fellow.
Great.
Whatever the hell that means.
I mean, why are they bothering?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. It's just after 10 to 12. I'm Russell Quirk, in for Alex Phillips, here till 1 o'clock, then handing over to Ian Collins. It's been a great show, I think, so far, particularly that Sean Woodward interaction. Your calls, your texts, your voice note messages are still coming in thick and fast with your comments. Not many in support of the Labour approach to lamenting the Tories of 14 years. It's all their fault in terms of our economy. But look, talking of politicians, let me put this name into your head for it to sit there for you to remember for a while. Councillor Oliver Freeston. Councillor Oliver Freeston is a 25-year-old former NHS worker, but he is now a Reform UK councillor in North East Lincolnshire, where actually Andrew Jenkins, of course, is trying to become the mayor of such place. Listen to this. So he stood up in a council meeting and said, and I'll paraphrase for a second, that basically he thinks that mental health strugglers, in terms of the amount of people that now use mental health, so depression, ADHD, anxiety, whatever it might be, as an excuse not to work, is, in his words, the 21st century version of the bad back. Now, when you look at the stats, insofar as 1 million people currently being off work with anxiety, that's in addition to the people that are off work with clinical depression. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that depression's not a thing, and I'm not suggesting that people with acute depression don't have a very, very valid reason, by the way, not to be at work. But what Oliver Freeston's saying, and I happen to totally and wholeheartedly agree with the councillor, is that this has gone too far. You've now got lots and lots of people using the excuse of a mental health ailment, particularly around anxiety, in order to simply shirk, to not work. Let's just watch this clip. This is Oliver Freeston on, I think, last night's show with Kevin O'Sullivan and Isabel Oakeshott talking about this very subject.
I'm a local councillor. I was in the health scrutiny panel, and I said, having been somebody with an experience in the health and social care background, I've seen firsthand what it's like for people with a genuine case of anxiety and depression. But I said that it's become too common now. People are throwing it around far too flippantly. We have children aged 8, 9, 10 years old going to teachers saying, "Miss, I'm depressed." And I know this because I speak to teachers firsthand. Children shouldn't know what depression is. They should be out playing with their friends, enjoying life. But that's the problem with the world we're now in, that it's almost become fashionable to be depressed. But there's also other reasons why people will go and say, "I've got anxiety and depression," because they know full well if they go to their GP and say, "I've got anxiety and depression, I can't go to work," they will get signed off for it. There was 18 million lost work days due to just poor mental health alone last year.
So do you agree with Oliver there that it has become far too easy, and actually not just easy, I would say fashionable almost, to play the mental health card, the anxiety card? You know, I'm a bit sad, you know, my pet has had to go to the vets and, you know, I was worried about him or her. I don't like who I sit next to. I don't like the fact that my boss tells me what I have to do on a daily basis. I don't like the fact that I have to actually go into the office rather than being able to work at home at my own behest. Oliver Freeston has a point, doesn't he? I'd love to know what you think of this. 0344 499 1000 or a voice note, which seems to be rather fashionable on this show, and indeed Mike Graham's show before me. WhatsApp 0344 499 1000. Let me know, because I think this is an epidemic of shirking, and I think Oliver Freeston is exactly right to point this out. But guess what happened to Councillor Freeston in the aftermath of him standing up as a politician, as a representative of the people in North East Lincolnshire, in the council chamber, to say, hey, I think this is a problem, I think this is a bit of an issue. He has effectively been censured. So directly afterwards, the next day, I think, he received an email from a member of the council team, so that would probably be something like what they call a monitoring officer, who said, I quote, there's a bit of a noise from a few quarters, both inside and outside the council. That noise is reaching me around certain comments made by you at the Health and Adult Social Care Scrutiny Panel on Wednesday evening. I naturally accept, says this council officer, that you're entitled to your opinion, as is everyone else, but perhaps you need to temper your comments somewhat. Why the hell should he? Whatever happened to free speech in this country? Let me know what you think. 0344 499 1000. Moz in Northamptonshire has called. I know you're calling about Lego, Moz, and I know it's very tempting to want to talk about this ridiculous Lego story. Just tell me what you think about this councillor, this reform councillor. Do you think he had the right to say what he said?
It's complicated, isn't it? It's a lot of things. Everyone... Well, because I don't understand the nuance of it properly, because I was more ringing up about the Lego issue.
Go on, let's just do Lego. Let's just do Lego. Go on, go on.
And I've got comments on other things, but yeah, the Lego thing I just find absolute insanity. Because I'm a gay man who's married, and they're just going to make normal straight people hate gay people more by coming out with redonkulous stuff like this. It's like they've got no common sense.
What would you say if you and your husband were at the Science Museum and you saw this display of bricks with this big kind of disclaimer, and indeed in your ear, you know, you're walking around with this this guide that is telling you as you get to that display of Lego bricks that it is anti or potentially anti-LGBT. Would you do something about it if you were in the Science Museum? Would you go up and say to someone that this is absolutely ridiculous and I'm not having it?
Yeah, I would. Honestly, I would. It's just insulting. And I don't see or understand how they're coming up with this. Because it's a kid's toy, it's a Lego. You know what I mean? Let kids be kids.
I totally agree with you, Moz. But this is
trying to change the narrative. Not you, but them. Stop trying to change narrative to make it look like, oh, look at us. We've won the right to get married and everything, but we still want more rights. No, we're happy. Leave us alone.
Well, according
That's
to
what
this,
gay used to mean. Gay used to mean happy.
According to this. Whatever it is, this network, which is this LGBT network at the Science Museum, they can see gender and LGBT pluses and minuses in everything. And as I said to somebody earlier on, I mean, does this apply to, you know, the humble 3-pin plug? And what about Velcro? Do you think Velcro is a bit anti-LGBT because it has kind of a male and a female element?
Well, if you go into that way of things, yeah, anything can be positive and negative, you know what I mean? Plus and a negative, they still go together.
Do you think there's other things that we should be worrying about, particularly when it comes to, I don't know, the Science Museum, like, I don't know, teaching our kids science? I mean,
teaching our history, teaching our science, what made this country great. Everything's against this country now.
Yeah.
Everyone who's got power hates us.
Yeah, I know.
So you've got influence.
It's ridiculous. Helena Hancock. Moz, I'm gonna have to say goodbye because I've got to go quickly to Adam now in Nottingham. Adam, thanks for calling. You've got to be quick, I'm afraid, mate.
Yes, you're talking about the benefit excuses and how this new thing's coming along. It's nothing new. It's just another excuse.
But it's an epidemic now. I think we're saying it's just got ridiculous. It's got bigger and bigger and bigger.
It's crazy. Now, I'll just take you through. Now, I do social housing, so I see all sorts of benefit cheats, and I see genuine people as well. And you can always tell the cheats. They've got the BMW in the driveway and the 60-inch TV on the thing, and you know, and they don't work. They don't do nothing, yet they have all the stuff. Now, I've just recently been off work with a pulled back, but I do a physical job. I took 3 days off. I could have had a week off, but I came back into work because I'm itching to do something.
Yeah.
I'm not that sort of person. And I have suffered depression. I can tell you I'm the same. I took that same thing. Oh, you're depressed. Why? Life's great. And then when you get depressed and you are, I get it now.
But Adam, did you snap out of it and go back to work?
Yes, I did. I never took time off. It was work that helped me with my depression, having something to get up for.
And Adam, I've got to go to the news, I'm afraid, my friend. But look, thanks for recounting your story. Look, we'll be back after this. I'm Russell Quirk. This is Talk. Back after the news.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. I'm Russell Quirk, in for Alex Phillips, here just for another hour, handing over to Ian Collins at 1 o'clock as ever. Let's catch up on the politics of the day, particularly around the economy and other stuff, with Lord Hayward, who's a Conservative peer and pollster. Lord Hayward, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the economy or anti-LGBT Lego?
Let's start with the economy.
OK. Yeah, so you're sensible.
I think it's fair to say that rarely has an interest rate cut been met with more negative news coverage. Normally there's headlines saying benefits for homeowners, mortgage holders and the like. But on this occasion, it's actually the revised economic forecasts that the Bank of England came out with at the same time, saying, look, we're going to slash the growth figures, the prospects are looking bad, the headroom for overall tax cuts is disappeared. The overall assessment is just so negative that it isn't any surprise that actually one of the pollsters today have come out with the worst confidence figures in the government since the general election, and the events of yesterday probably indicate that they'll get worse.
Yes, and of course it's against a backdrop of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer talking incessantly before the election and in order to get elected, and then since, about growth and putting more money in people's pockets. That the Labour Party are apparently, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here with big inverted commas, the saviour of Britain's economy, that they're going to rescue it. You may have heard Sean Woodward earlier on, one of your old colleagues, talking about how this is all the Conservatives' fault, even though, of course, the economy was recovering before before the election in July. So the Labour Party don't seem to be listening, frankly, and don't seem to be doing anything any differently than perhaps they've always done by way of their ideology. But let's just be very, very clear, Robert, can we, in terms of the seriousness, I think, of what Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor, said yesterday in his comments as a consequence of him and the MPC reducing interest rates to 4.5%. And by the way, 2 members of that monetary committee wanting to cut interest rates by 0.5%. That's how serious those 2 individuals think the economy is in terms of its performance. So we're in a situation now where, and I would argue, and I think the Bank of England governor didn't quite go this far, but I would argue that as a consequence of Rachel Reeves' decision since July, and particularly in the budget in October, particularly with that £40 billion extra tax burden on Britain, that we have ended up going backwards. GDP, as in the measure of how big our economy is in reverse, and inflation, of course, that spectre, inflation starting to increase again. The Bank of England saying that growth in 2025 will be half what they thought it was going to be just a few weeks ago, so only 0.75%, but really worryingly that growth reduction will be kind of married to an increase in inflation, what we used to call in the old days stagflation.
Yes, you've carried on where I left off, all the other bits of bad news that were in the Bank of England's overall analysis. And that is the daunting aspect of this. And I think for the average person out there, the negativity, which we saw, as you say, before the budget, then the response to the budget. But even now, the problem for the government is that they're saying, well, we're taking tough decisions. But what do they do? At the same time, they're talking about a huge sum of money in relation to the Chagos Islands. Now, most people don't know where the Chagos Islands are. They've no idea why there should be such a huge sum of money going to Mauritius. And that's when, at the same time, you're saying you can't have winter fuel allowances, you've got to have increase in national insurance contribution, just everything you can imagine.
And there's a real, but Robert, there's a real dichotomy there. And it's hard for all of us to understand how the government can talk about just a few days after being elected that there was all of a sudden this black hole that they didn't know about, even though, as you well know, those books, the government books, would have been open and available to them for months before the election. So that we're not really buying, as indeed the Office of Budget Responsibility are not buying, this whole £22 billion black hole thing. But as I said to Sean Woodward, how do you square the circle when you're talking to a 70-year-old pensioner in a cold lounge in Newcastle and you tell them that you've taken away their £300 winter fuel allowance? How do you explain that alongside also explaining that even though there's no money, we are sending, as you say, £18 billion to Mauritius to pay them to take something that we own, £22 billion in carbon capture, which most people agree doesn't work or certainly is not proven, and then of course £8 billion a year in foreign aid, plus another £15 billion to help other countries with climate change. I mean, you can forgive, Elsie Smith from Newcastle thinking, well, why can't you give me my £300 when you've just given £40 billion away?
Well, the interesting thing is, and Nigel Farage is making a great fuss about the opinion polls, it's fair to say that broadly at the moment, you've probably got 3 major parties together in opinion polls. But those are measuring static people with, when they're not actually having to put a cross against a name in a ballot paper. Yesterday, there were by-elections in some essentially Labour areas in Rochester, in Gillingham, in Lancashire.
Council elections.
And the Labour Party, sorry?
Council elections.
Yes, but council by-elections, where previously sitting councillors have stood down. And what happened? Labour lost 3 seats. Reform gained 3. Now, there was a switch. The Conservatives gained 1 and lost 1. But the net result, the real big headline is Labour loses 3 seats, essentially in Labour areas, and came close to losing the other one in Gillingham. And this is the message that people are really delivering week in, week out in council by-elections.
Well, and this is why, Robert, that we've got a Prime Minister that seems intent on cancelling as many local elections in May as he possibly can. But I have to say, the Conservatives also supported it. Certainly in my county of Essex and in Hampshire, the Conservatives have voted alongside the Labour politicians that they sit opposite, they're all voting for this because they're all scared of losing their seats to reform.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's quite a fair analogy. There is no question we have one hell of a mess in local government at the moment. Depending on where you live, you have one council, two councils, you have town and parish councils, you might have regional mayors, and therefore there needs to be some restructuring. But the Lib Dems and Reform have both said, oh, you're taking away our democratic rights. As you say, Essex is one of the places where that's happening. But there's no question that local government needs restructuring. It's something that has been going on for a while. I'm not unhappy that the announcement has been made that we're going to restructure local government. What I am at a loss to understand is why you do it piecemeal in Essex, Norfolk and Suffolk, but you don't do it at the same time in Kent or Hertfordshire.
Because I would venture, as a bit of a conspiracy theory here, that these are the areas that the Conservatives and Labour are most concerned about in terms of losing councillors. I think there's a connection there that we just got to join the dots. Let's move on though, Robert, if we can. Let's talk about Kemi Badenoch and her attempts over the last day or two to placate the Conservative base a little by coming out with the following, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with regard to migrant workers, that she would insist, if she were Prime Minister, that about half of them, given their lack of earnings, them not hitting the earnings threshold, half of them would be barred from staying in the UK under her plans. This is just a little sticking plaster, isn't it? It's not really going to make any difference to Kemi Badenoch's appeal from the grassroots, is it?
No, I think it's the first step on what everybody would expect to be a long series of comments. You had the first step, which was before the announcement of this part of immigration policy. You had the announcement that, look, we made a lot of errors, we, the Conservative Party, whether it's Kemi Badenoch or whether it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson, made a lot of errors, particularly in the last few years of their administration. We're now looking at it anew. The comments about immigration are a part of what I would expect to be a long developing process over the coming months or the next year, 2 years, of policies that they will put forward at the next general election.
But the question I have to ask, Robert, is are the Conservative base, those voters that have traditionally voted Conservative, are now disappointed in the Conservatives, and obviously that reflected in the general election result in July. Are Conservative voters going to be convinced by these new platitudes from Kemi Badenoch as they develop over the next few months?
Not in the short term. You don't change people's minds. The one message that there was at the general election was, we don't want the Conservatives. There was no message, we want the Labour Party or anything else. There was just, we don't want the Conservative Party. You don't, in any opinion polling analysis, turn that sort of perception round in a matter of weeks or months. It takes you years to do so. So, as I said just now, this is what I would expect to be the first step over a period of the next year or two. People are not going to respond just to one message on one day. They need messages over months, if not over a year, year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah, and not just messages, Robert. I mean, obviously some robust, traditional Conservative policies when it comes to immigration. You as a party have got to out-reform reform. You've got to get some of those reform voters, as they are now, that were Conservatives, and indeed Labour voters that are concerned about immigration, which is a fair chunk. We go back to the Brexit vote of 2016. Most Labour constituencies actually seem to vote for Brexit, so I think there's a proxy there in terms of how dyed-in-the-wool old-school Labour voters feel about immigration. You've got to, as a party, Kemi Badenoch has got to not just talk the talk. I mean, she's got to make it compelling, hasn't she, to get those voters back on immigration?
Yeah, I'm not talking here as a Conservative. I'm analysing the polls and people's the public's attitudes. What happened in the run-up to the last election, and you can measure it in the opinion polls, is that, first of all, the public lost confidence in the Tory party's competence to run the country.
Yeah.
Having decided that the Conservatives were incompetent, people went in one of two directions. They went to Reform stroke abstain, or they went towards Labour stroke Lib Dems. The people who moved towards Reform and abstention, for them, immigration was a dominant issue in their minds. For the people who went towards Labour and the Lib Dems, it was NHS and climate change were issues that influence the direction. But the first instance was competence stroke the economy, and then the population diverged. And that's why the Conservatives have to get a message about immigration across to a large section of the population. But I think it's worthwhile just commenting on one other thing. Reform voters are clearly not just solely Conservative voters. There is a fair proportion of them, and we will see it in May in the elections in places like Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Lancashire, that a fair amount of Reform voters are actually strong ex-Labour voters.
Yeah, indeed. And let's just quickly talk about the polls. I want to ask you about Liz Kendall in a second, and a rare slither of sense from a Labour frontbencher. But let's come back to that in a second. When it comes to polling, the Reform performance right now is, in some polls, of course, Reform are more popular than both the Labour Party and the Conservatives. What do you think that translates to if there were a general election in the next few days in terms of Reform seats? Because, of course, what the polls say and actually what parliamentary seats look like are two rather different things, aren't they?
Absolutely. And Nigel Farage is quite reasonably playing up the poll that gives Reform the biggest percentage. He's not identifying those where the Conservative, over the last 48 hours, there's been 3 different polls and they've produced 3 different results. What one can say is there is a very clear indication of the areas where Reform support is coming from. Your county is one, North Kent is another, but particularly North Kent. But then you look for Reform in the Midlands, the old industrial heartlands, the coal mining belts, South Yorkshire.
And Wales, Robert? Wales, I think, has got seen a surge in Reform support, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And it's the same sort of background. It's the coal mining, industrial, what demographers call the white working class vote, which is quite definitely moving towards Reform.
So basically it's everywhere apart from London and the South West.
No, there's an awful lot of counties that you can...
That's pretty inspiring for Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got the whole of the South West. You've got places like Hampshire and Sussex and Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, and you go into the rural Midlands and Shropshire, and even in Wales. It's specifically parts of Wales. We're not talking about other parts of it. And then you go to Cumbria. So no, each of the political parties, and I here include the Lib Dems as well,
I remember them,
has territory which is going to look attractive to them at a general election. But let's be realistic. The general election is not going to be for another 4 years.
It's not. It's a long, long time. I mean, a day in politics now, let alone a week in politics, is a long, long time. 4 years is, yes, a political lifetime, I guess. How hard would it be based on, and I asked this because at the beginning of the show, I was talking to somebody about their prediction that Reform will form the next government. And no matter how much you think that you might want them to, that's a pretty tall order from a base of 5 MPs. How unlikely is that in terms of Reform having to end up with, 320 or so, 326 MPs? How unlikely is that from this current 5 MP foundation that they've built?
It's unlikely in that they get to a certain point and they do very well. They leap dramatically from 5 through to 70 or 80, and then there's another dramatic point taking them to 150 stroke 170.
This is seats, yeah?
In seats, sorry, yeah. Yes. What happens then depends on the willingness of the anti-Reform voters to form a coalition, not so much with the Conservatives or which part of the Conservatives, but between Labour and Liberal Democrats in particular, and whether they're willing to cross their votes over backwards and forwards, and what base they work on. Yeah. So it is a complex possibility, particularly because there are parts of the population, rather like Boris Johnson, the population, there are some that love Nigel Farage, but there's actually more that loathe him. And it's a question of whether those people will transfer those votes.
Let's see. And Robert, just quickly before you go, the comments from Liz Kendall, who is the Work and Pension Secretary, saying that long-term sickness is not an automatic reason not to work. As a Conservative, I suspect you'd agree with her, wouldn't you?
I would agree with her completely. We've seen a huge jump post-COVID in terms of the number of people on sickness benefit, and we've got to change that as a society. There's lots of things we've got to change, and that is just one of them.
Yep. Lord Hayward, thank you very much, as ever, Conservative peer and pollster. He'll be back with us soon, no doubt. Going to take a break, and you will be back with us in a second because we're going to take some of your calls. I'm Russell Quirk, this is Talk. Back after this.
The other day, an activity session being run by the Royal Museums in Greenwich. They're running drag aerobic sessions for children of all ages, and having looked at the advertising material, it looks like softcore pornography. Another example, King's College London, meant to be one of the best educational institutes of the country, has just appointed a quote-unquote asexual activist as a research fellow.
Great.
Whatever the hell that means.
I mean, why are they bothering?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Hello and welcome back. Good afternoon. It's just gone 20 past 12. I'm here till 1 o'clock. I'm in for Alex Phillips, of course, and yes, Ian Collins after me. Earlier on, I had a chat with Sean Woodward, who's the ex-Labour MP and Northern Ireland Secretary, and it seems to have triggered you all. Here's a little compilation of some of the many, many voice notes that we've had over the last hour or so.
Sean Woodward, like most members of the Labour Party, is economically illiterate.
Typical Labour minister, again, blaming the Tories. How long are we going to do this for?
The guy's economically illiterate.
And they keep saying, blaming the Tories for it. I can't understand it. He's a moron.
Sean Woodward is just repeating the Labour mantra, tax and spend.
As per usual, Labour not wanting to answer any questions.
There's lots more where they came from, not just animated, but a trigger, but animated. Quite incredible, really. So, but look, keep them coming. You can either text 87222 plus the word talk, or call me 0344 499 1000, or on WhatsApp if you call that same number 0344 499 1000. You also can leave a voice note. So let's go to calls though. There's been lots of those. Mark in Lincolnshire is first up. Mark, thanks for calling Talk.
Hi there, mate. You all right?
Yeah, good. Thanks. How are you?
Yeah, not so bad today. Yeah, just the whole reform thing in the next election. I think people are getting themselves a little bit too excited if they think reform are going to outright win the next election. I think what is a much more reasonable scenario is a Tory reform coalition with, preferably, I'm not particularly a reform voter anymore. I mean, I've moved over to UKIP, but I would prefer, if that was the case, with reform in the lead, if that makes sense, with the more seats, to take a lead position. Otherwise, we'll just end up with another Tory government. And to be honest, I think the only way Farage would actually work with them is if that was the scenario. I don't think he'd work the other way around. But as far as reform themselves go, and Farage in particular, Mr. Snake Oil salesman, I'm not very impressed with him. They were far more authentic under Tice.
What do you think he's selling, Mark, that is snake oil? What do you think he's selling that isn't authentic?
Well, what he's selling is offering people a solution to immigration, which is, let's face it, you guys say this all the time on the station. People are voting reform, people bang on about reform because it's immigration is their central point, their central issue. Okay, well, Farage isn't going to fix immigration. His ideas of net zero immigration doesn't do anything. All it does is put a hold on it. The issues within the country are going to remain exactly the same.
But are they, though? But no, I hear you. And I think, look, Mark, you're probably a symptom of the fact that we've had successive governments say over many, many decades that they're going to do things, particularly on immigration. I mean, we've been hearing this since 2010 under David Cameron. So for the last 15 years, we've been hearing in particular that immigration is going to be curtailed. Net immigration is going to come down. And we're sick of hearing it. And we're sick of successive governments and now parties talking about it and not doing anything about it. But, in fairness to reform, and I'm not necessarily banging the drum here for reform specifically, but they are a party that in the last election, in terms of their contract with the people, did say exactly what they would do to tackle this, i.e. they would take us out of the ECHR, so we're no longer wedded to the Convention on Human Rights and so on. They said that they would consider turning the boats back. They've also said that they would consider camps for migrants that effectively, and I don't want to use the words internment camp because obviously it wouldn't be that, I'm sure, but processing camps that would be secure. I mean, they have talked much tougher than the likes of Rishi Sunak, Kemi Badenoch, and indeed Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer. So, but you're not buying it? What? Just because they're also politicians and they're all the same? Is that what you're saying?
Not especially. I mean, I personally think Farage is much more in line with the Conservative way of thinking than anything else. I think he would fit quite easily into the Tory party.
Well, he was a Tory years ago. He was a Tory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's a lot of my concern with Nigel has always been, his desire to punish the Tories. Yeah. As far as reforming their immigration policy, yeah, they do talk a game on it, that's for sure. And, I have no doubt that if they were in charge, they certainly would leave the ECHR. And that is an essential thing.
Well, that would be a big step forward. That would be a big step forward. Look, Mark, I've got to let you go because we've got a full switchboard here. Let me go to David in Exeter. David, thanks for calling Talk.
Hi, Russell.
Hi, how you doing? What do you want to say?
Yeah, I'm good. You were talking to Lord Hayward about the budgetary illiteracy.
Yes.
With spending huge amounts of money across a spectrum of stuff, starting with this Chagos ridiculous situation.
The £18 billion giveaway, yeah.
Yeah. So I think probably the best way to view this, really, so you're saying sort of, financial illiteracy. Well, let's look at the strategic illiteracy.
Yeah.
In the context of war in Europe and elsewhere, we have senior military officers, both here and in America, saying, there are significant problems with gaps in capabilities, ammunition, etc., air defence in the UK, where we require investment now. So against senior military officer advice, the government, as it stands, so that's Starmer, and particularly where Chagos is concerned, Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor, are refusing to invest. They're kicking back the review that they've got, but at the same time, he's scurrying all around Europe, attempting to conclude the defence pact they want with the EU, which equates to defence union with the EU, but not investing in the national position.
And in the national position, by that you mean the percentage of GDP that should be spent on defence. So not even getting to 2.5%. So I think in their election manifesto, although that was ripped up and put in the bin on July the 5th, let's be honest, the Labour Party manifesto, what the Labour government was saying as they came in was that they would aspire to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence. Donald Trump, of course, talking about nations should be spending 5% of GDP.
So he's a world apart, really. I mean, the Trump analysis from their wide awake club of military people, the circle of people he's got around him, are on target with that. They're talking reality.
But David, are you saying something's going on here? I mean, am I joining the dots incorrectly? Are you suggesting that the reason that he won't spend money on defence, and by the way, if he didn't spend £18 billion by giving it to Mauritius, he could spend that on defence, and that actually might take us up to about 3 to 3.5, maybe even 4% of GDP spent on defence. So we could easily do that. He's choosing not to do that. Do you think what we're heading towards is him relying on a European defence force, a European army? In other words, he seeks to give away our defensive capability to Europe. Is that what we're talking about here?
Okay, let's wash this up because you're right over it. So the correct legalese in terms of reference is defence union. All right, don't refer to it as an EU army because that's not what it is. That doesn't exist. That's a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, and actually, unfortunately, we've got to be really quick, David. Can you do this in about 10 seconds? Sorry.
I can. So this is an area of significant risk concern because he's not ordering. And he's not placing orders and investing in our national military, His Majesty's Armed Forces. What's going to happen is he's going to bet the European position and go in with Ursula's common defence procurement, which will mean EU kit with EU command.
Yeah, we should be very worried about that. David and Exeter, brilliant. Thank you for that. Very informative. Quickly, before we go to a break, let's go to Damien on the economy as a voice note. Damien has something to say.
Your council tax will not go up by a single penny. Yes, you heard that right. Not a single penny on your council tax. But it will go up by lots of pounds.
I think that's Andre Walker pranking me, isn't it? Sounded like him with putting on a silly voice. Yeah, I don't know what that was all about. I have absolutely no comment whatsoever. Let me get my head around it. Back after this.
Across the UK on DAB+. On your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. I'm Russell Quirk, in for Alex Phillips, here till 1 o'clock. We talked earlier on about Lego apparently being anti-LGBT, and a story that's similarly ridiculous, frankly, is Ed Miliband's continuing quest to spend all of our money, it seems, on madcap net zero ideas, including £22 billion of your money on unproven carbon capture technology. Now, those words are not just mine, although I totally agree with them. They are the words of the Commons Public Accounts Committee. So, to be clear, a parliamentary committee that has said that Mr. Miliband has not properly investigated whether this technology was affordable, and they are raising the alarm about the viability of the technology. So, yes, just to clarify, Ed Miliband is committing £22 billion of your money on technology that probably doesn't work. And I take you back to the earlier conversations about pensioners, waspy women, farmers, and so on. Well, look, to try and unpack this and see if perhaps we can make sense of it, maybe it's a good idea. Let's speak to Andy Mayer, who's an energy analyst at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I suspect, Andy, you think this is as nuts as I do.
Yeah, so we're here again with carbon capture and storage.
What is it? Can you explain what it is?
Yeah, so very simply, when you have a big industrial process, such as making cement or steel or generating electricity, you emit CO2 from many of those processes, particularly when you use fossil fuels. And the inspiration behind carbon capture is if you can somehow capture that CO2, stick it in a pipe, put it under the ground and put it into something like a saline aquifer or some other geological formation under the sea, then you can remove carbon from the atmosphere. So the excitement about it is about it being a negative emissions technology that may help us tackle some of the UK's targets. The trouble is it's quite an expensive way of doing that.
22 billion quid, no kidding.
Well, yeah, so it's over 25 years. It's about £1 billion a year. And if that was actually the only money that was needed to do it, then you would see industry doing it anyway. And the reason they don't is because if you attach carbon capture technology to industry, including generation, you just make it more inefficient. So about 15 to 40% more inefficient for every process you use. So if you imagine you're a steel maker and Ed comes calling and says, wouldn't it be brilliant if we could have your technology but with carbon captured? They say, well, no, because we're an international global business, and if we do that, then we won't be competitive. So what you end up with instead is shutting down industry.
So I thought, though, and forgive me if I'm wrong, that our kind of quest towards net zero meant that we were going to have the green and pleasant land of Britain covered with wind turbines and solar panels, and there wouldn't be any fossil fuel emissions anymore. But you're saying this is particularly from manufacturing, which creates carbon.
Well, it's manufacturing and generation.
Right.
So while we still need fossil fuel-based generation, which is going to be at least 10 to 20 years, if not longer, we might need this if it made sense. The problem is it doesn't make sense.
Well, it doesn't. It's expensive, but also what's happening in the United States, drill, baby drill, and in China and India and elsewhere is that in our pathetic quest to get to net zero, given that I don't think the question is settled, the debate is settled with regard to this whole kind of carbon equals planetary heat thing anyway. But even if we do get to net zero, even if we do spend £22 billion on carbon capture to help us get to it, isn't it completely and utterly negated by the increase in fossil fuel output from those three biggest countries on the planet in terms of their output?
Yeah, well, definitely that. I mean, the UK produces less than 1%.
So it's a complete waste of money.
And falling.
So it's a complete waste of money.
Yeah, so this has been known about for 20 years when they first started trying to do it. And everybody sensible told successive governments, don't try and do a massive plan for carbon capture and storage. Set a carbon price in the economy, which we already have. It's about £45 per tonne of CO2. And if they can do carbon capture and storage at £45 per tonne, then do it. They'll just get on with it. Leave it well alone. Let industry come together and see if they can produce it. But the reality is, if carbon capture and storage was going to work, the Chinese would have done it. They've got the massive industrial clusters. They use coal-fired power. They're the ones who could actually demonstrate it working. We're not. we're mostly a service-based economy. We've already got rid of large parts of our heavy industry.
And the worrying thing is, Andy, that even Dale Vince, who, I think it's fair to say he is on the more extreme side of the climate debate. Dale Vince of Ecotricity, the man that receives lots and lots of subsidies from the taxpayer to make lots and lots of money for his business, essentially based on so-called renewables and sustainable energy. Even he doesn't agree that carbon capture works.
Yeah, so we've got to be a bit careful because this is a stopped clock being right twice a day. Dale is in the renewable energy business. The renewable energy industry as a whole does not like carbon capture. It doesn't like hydrogen. It doesn't like nuclear. And there's quite a lot of knocking copy that they put out.
Well, because they compete with their business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But actually, I mean, not even, because you'd still need fossil fuel-based generation even in a mostly renewable system, because it's when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, you need proper backup. But anyway, I mean, he's right about this, but he's right for the wrong reasons. And the very simple reason that we shouldn't be doing carbon capture and storage is it's just not economic. If it was economic, you wouldn't need government intervention. And at the levels of subsidy the government are proposing, it's already covered by the carbon price. So £45 per tonne of CO2, 20 to 30 million tons of CO2 is supposed to be saved by this every year. If that were all true, you wouldn't need any intervention. And instead, the government's gone down this very mad, heavy-handed interventionist approach. There's a 300-page document just on the code for connecting carbon capture sites to other technologies, and so it goes on. So they just need to pull back from this, cancel the projects. Let's see if the market with the existing carbon taxes we already have can actually deliver this, and if not, doesn't matter.
And has anyone presumably spoken to Ed Miliband about the fact that this doesn't work?
People have been speaking to Ed Miliband all the time because
So why is he not listening? Why does he think it's okay to spend 22 billion quid of our money, despite the fact that experts like you are telling him it doesn't work?
Well, I mean, I want to be nice to Ed Miliband.
No, don't do that.
No,
what's the point?
He's actually done something sensible with nuclear power, which is to get the government out of the way from some of it. So neutron Ed we quite like. It's climate Ed and digging a hole in the ground Ed and filling it with carbon that's a bit mad. So, yeah. I mean, let's hope that he's looking at these numbers and this very good report from the Parliamentary Committee and saying we probably can do with a different plan.
Yes, okay. It's just very, very concerning, isn't it? Particularly when it comes to the economics of this. And as we talked about all show, really, the fact that there's no money, even though the Labour government seem to be continually spending more and more money, particularly on these ridiculous and frankly pointless projects. And of course, this is on top of the, I think it's £18 billion that we're sending to other countries to help them with climate mitigation. So that, by my maths, is 40 billion quid on stuff that doesn't work, is irrelevant, and we shouldn't be spending money on.
So this money hasn't yet been spent. If you go into the detail of the report, the government is saying at the moment this is going to be put onto future bills and future taxes. So it may never happen. But if that's the case, then what the government has done is sent out this signal that they're going to waste money before they've even wasted it.
Yeah.
So there is a chance to pull back.
Yes, no, indeed. Well, look, let's see. I mean, do you think Ed Miliband can survive this on the basis that most people are saying that, look, this stuff really doesn't work and it's pointless and you're spending, the public's money unnecessarily and inappropriately? I mean, do you see him staying in post to the next election? Seriously? Because some of this stuff surely has to come home to roost, Andy, doesn't it, in terms of the futility of this spending, this ideological, nutty approach?
Well, the tension in the cabinet is between the pro-growth mission and the climate mission. Yeah. And if you'd asked me this question last week, then it did look pretty bleak for him because he was offering nothing other than obstruction to growth, of which this is one example. And as I say, the thing that's changed this week is that he's actually taken a different, more free market approach to nuclear power. Not entirely, but that's a start. And if he can learn from his previous mistakes and get the government out of the way in other areas, which he's going to have to do for any of this to work, then maybe he could stay in post. But...
Well, I'm laughing because the thought of politicians learning from their mistakes is, yes, not something I think is going to happen. Andy Mayer, Energy Analyst, Institute of Economic Affairs, thank you. I'm Russell Quirk, back right after this.
we need to get back to basics. When someone turns up here illegally, you've got to send them straight back, Mike. And if you find someone on the street, you've got to send them straight back. You've got to do that really, really quickly and not mess about. And we haven't. We've created this bureaucracy, this machinery, which enables lawyers to get migrants into a bureaucratic process, and delay for them is victory. The longer they can delay the case, the more likely it is that person's going to get to stay in the end, no matter what they've done.
Exactly right.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back. Just 15 minutes of this stuff to go, then Ian Collins at 1 o'clock. Let's see what Brendan from Hartlepool thinks about carbon capture, shall we?
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good. Yeah, not bad. You?
Right. Yeah, fine. First of all, I don't think we should do carbon capture in the first place, because we should actually be putting more CO2 into the air so plants grow better. But that's another story altogether. Secondly, the cheapest way of doing carbon capture is plant more trees. That's what trees are. They're basically carbon dioxide in a physical form. That's why fossil fuels is all carbon dioxide. When you set fire to it, return it back to its natural element. So trees grow, they take all the carbon dioxide in, give out oxygen, which we need, and the wood is basically stores the carbon dioxide. So this takes me back to my O-level biology. Was it photosynthesis, turning carbon dioxide into oxygen? But again, why don't the politicians understand this then, Brendan? Would just be, and bearing in mind we have got a lot of forests and woodland in Britain, haven't we? So isn't that adequate enough? Well, if you've got the guy who's in charge, who brought all this in when he was the energy secretary in the last Labour government, I mean, the guy can't eat a bacon sandwich, so that shows you his level of...
But they're all the same. Do you remember David Cameron, though, 15 years ago? He started off his election campaign in the Arctic, worried about the ozone layer. I mean, that's where it all started, isn't it? And I have to say, I suspect, Brendan, that most politicians don't know anything about the science behind this debate. They are just trotting out, the same old thing.
They're led exactly by what the COP conferences do.
Exactly.
There's two reports that have been out at the COP conference.
Well, Brendan, I'm going to have to cut you short because, again, full switchboard. Sorry to do that. Sorry to cut you off in your prime. But we've got to talk about Meghan Markle. Can we see a clip of Meghan's wonderful, wonderful series, which, of course, was postponed because of the LA fires, if you remember correctly. And it's coming out. Don't worry. You will see it. It's coming out. I think, is it March the 6th? Something like that. Who cares? Anyway, this is the clip.
I've always loved taking something pretty ordinary and elevating it. Surprising people with moments that let them know I was really thinking of them.
What? This is probably one of the most glamorous moments of my life. It's magic.
I'm going to share some little tips and tricks. I see what color I gravitate to, and everything goes from there. And how you can incorporate these practices every day. That's what you want. You want that shape and texture. This is about connecting with friends. I love that we're doing this together for the first time. Making new friends. That is so good.
We're family now.
And just learning.
Look at how much honey we have.
Do you believe in love? We're not in the pursuit of perfection. Woke us all up. We're in the pursuit of joy.
So I'm only watching that because Ted made me watch that. I mean, I wouldn't normally choose to, and I wouldn't normally impose it upon you. What cringeable, vomit-inducing nonsense. And this, by the way, the reason we're talking about this, apart from the fact that, yes, don't worry, it's coming out soon, despite the delay, but it's the fact, of course, as I'm going to talk to Rupert Bell about now, is that this portrays Meghan Markle as being some kind of Martha Stewart, you know, that she's got a mixing bowl and her caster sugar and her flour, and she's kind of making this stuff from scratch, kind of Meghan's recipes. You know, if you want to make a Victoria sponge or whatever, she's the girl to go to in terms of the recipe. But of course this show is not that at all. There's no recipes in it. There's no, you know, 2 ounces of this and 4 tablespoons of that. This is literally just a PR pastiche of nonsense to make her look like a normal human being. Rupert Bell, what do you think of this?
Well, every time I have to watch the trailer, it makes me cringe. But
we're paying you to watch it, mate.
This isn't even filmed in her house, and you know, if she's talking about lifestyle, she lives in a gilded life. I mean, when did she last turn the washing machine on?
She wouldn't even know where it is.
You know, and when did she last get out there planting the seeds and growing everything? It's filmed in someone else's house, so that immediately makes it fake. There's probably a significant production crew preparing everything. And yes, she's saying this is how we want to live and, you know, have our friends around. Looking at the list of friends she's got who are coming, it's not a really A-list lot. I think there's the wife of the polo player who featured in the polo documentary.
Her makeup artist, Rupert?
Yeah, makeup art. So you just feel that it's not going out on a limb. And it just, look, we haven't seen it. It comes out on March the 4th. We may be surprised. But Netflix didn't even mention their upcoming series the other day when they had a big launch of something that was happening, even after the delay. Yes, the CEO has come out and said he's excited by this, but you would have expected...
Did he say that with a straight face? Did he really?
Well, I don't know, but he did say that...
So hang on, Rupert. Sorry, let me just get this clear. So you got the guy that commissioned The Day of the Jackal, one of the best series I've ever seen, is equally as excited about Meghan gazing longingly at her dog across somebody else's kitchen.
Well, surely from a commercial point of view, he has to be excited because there are supposed allegedly 100 million reasons why they are hop deep in the Meghan and Harry
extravaganza. But Rupert, on that note, so you make a good point. So this is, they say, the last element of the $100 million deal that Harry and Meghan did with Netflix. Is that right?
I believe so, but you know, there's reportedly films in development. Meghan's got the rights to a book, which they're now trying to develop potentially into a film with Netflix's backing. So the whole thing is, you know, up in the air. And this series does need to be a success. Yes, look, I'm going to have to watch it. I'm not the target market. Let's be quite clear. But what I want to see, if it's genuinely authentic, then you might say people want it.
Sorry, you think genuinely and authentic and Meghan Markle are the words that go in the same sentence?
Not normally, but clearly it's going to be edited and make her look good because that's what she does. But it's not, you know, if she's about friends, let's look as if she's enjoying it and it's not got a production crew behind them in somebody else's house, not even in their house.
But Rupert, you know, we know all this, right? And you know this, and, you know, celebrity showbiz correspondents in The Sun and The Times know this. The public know this. So this is just another attempt to insult the public, isn't it?
It could easily be. I mean, that's where it will fail. If it's seen to be, you know, sometimes you get surprising pro. One of the reasons the hairy bikers have been so successful, they are just who they are. They're authentic. They do their thing and they look as if they're enjoying it, and there's no airs and graces. You know, with the Meghan thing, it will be all designed to make her look good. But when did those, you know, those hands don't do much cooking. I'm sure there's somebody in their house who does or prepares.
I suspect, Rupert, dare I venture, they don't do much of anything. Yeah, it's I think it insults the intelligence of the public. It is not authentic. It's not even her house. The friends seem to be kind of shipped in and just there to be paid. Harry's not even in it, is he? I don't think. I think you get a glimpse of him in it, and that's about it.
Well, I think he'll be featuring much in it. They didn't feature much in the polo documentary, which certainly had the polo world's thinking, what's this about? Was you know, it did not work at all, didn't show the sport in a particularly flattering light, so that didn't work. And Harry might be conspicuous by his absence, but the point is, because it's not filmed at home, she's moving down the road, going somewhere else, does a day's filming, and I mean, looking at the trailer, I mean, who needs to see these fancy flower jars and everything. It just doesn't feel very authentic that it's going to resonate with great swathes.
No, it won't. But it's hilarious that either she thinks that we think that that is her daily life, that she spends most of her time in the kitchen baking for Harry, or indeed that it's how we spend our lives. I mean, it's just not real world. But the big question for me, Rupert, maybe you can help me with this, is that over the last 3 or 4 years, we've kind of all presupposed, even accused Harry and Meghan of taking a Netflix crew with them wherever they go, including potentially the likes of Prince Philip's funeral and so on. Were we wrong, or are we going to see more and more of these series, these productions coming out where indeed, and let's take the LA fires as an example, obviously Meghan and Harry turned up in LA to hug people and kind of, give their commiserations and show empathy. Do we think that there has been a kind of behind-the-scenes camera effort that we're going to see on Netflix or somewhere else over the next year or two? Do you think that's going to happen?
I'm not sure it is going to happen at the moment, because one of the accusations is that when Spare came out and this documentary came out, they always seem to be having a pop at other people, i.e. the royal family. So that's why they've got to get away from it. They've got to prove that they can move on and actually produce content that works. Well, so far the podcast didn't work with that Meghan brought out, because they were just, again, about her, rather than engaging with potentially some very interesting guests, but that didn't happen and didn't move on. And they're supposedly with a new podcast production company. We've heard nothing from that. There's been no new podcast. So at the moment, they're in a bit of a vacuum because they don't know how to move forward. And actually, we all know getting good content is extremely difficult, and you've got to work very hard at it. And
well, indeed. And Rupert, I suggest that Netflix might want some of their $100 million back. Rupert Bell, Talk's royal correspondent, thank you for your analysis there. What do you think about Ian Collins, who's just walked into the studio? Big Meghan fan, I understand you are.
Yeah, love the Meghan or the Big M, always texting each other on a regular basis.
So will you be watching this trash? I guess we watch it because we have to.
That's the only time I've ever clocked any of those kind of Netflix things is because we have to. When we were doing the talk and those kind of programmes.
It's the broadcast equivalent of being paid to, but also almost, the producers here sticking matchsticks in our eyes and forcing us to watch this stuff.
Well, I didn't realise when I started watching it that about 10 minutes in I'd started to gnaw off my own elbow. It was that subliminal as I did it.
And what's more ridiculous, do you think, and you may even be talking about this in your show, that or the fact that Lego is anti-LGBT, which I've been talking about a lot.
I've said it all. I won't let my kids play with Lego. It's very homophobic, this
Don't want to step
Lego.
on it.
Don't step on the Lego, don't build stuff with it, don't start getting all boyish with your Lego, because that's a little bit too alpha male, a little bit too testosterone ridden.
So your show coming up, are you going to be sensible, or are you going to do some silly stuff?
Well, it is a Friday, so we'll look at tech a little bit later on, which is always a nice thing on a Friday. We are going to look at why the nation is so flipping sick as well. I mean, this story keeps coming up. I mean, what is wrong with everybody? I mean, what is this literally just about?
It's a post-pandemic thing. It's a post-pandemic thing.
Is it though?
It's almost like we were told to stay at home and we got used to it, and we thought, well, actually, now we can do a lot of things at home that we didn't think we could.
I think that is true.
Yeah,
I think there is true.
But it's also this kind of woke. What does Donald Trump call it? The woke mind virus that has made particularly youngsters, those under the age of 30, think that, well, actually, I can just play the anxiety card and I can get away with murder.
But also, I don't even know if they have to think that, because I think many of those kids think the anxiety thing is a reason not to go to work.
Do you think they think it's real?
Yeah, I think they think it's real. Genuinely, I'm not feeling good, so therefore you don't go to work.